Welcome back to Harry's Verse, where the impossible gets its day in court. Today's story: what if Harry Potter shattered the Ministry and forged his own magical empire? Before we dive in, do hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so the next tale finds you the moment it drops. Settle in, let's begin. Chapter 1: The verdict. Courtroom 10 sat at the bottom of the Ministry the way a cellar sits under a house, the place where you put the things you did not want guests to find. Stone tiers climbed into shadow. The torches burned low and blue because the Wisengamot had decided sometime in the last century that justice photographed better in gloom. Harry Potter stood at the speaking floor with his hands clasped behind his back and counted the empty seats. 40 seats sat empty out of 50. That was the first lie, and nobody in the room would call it one. A full bench convicted nobody without effort. A thin bench could be steered. Cassius Selwyn, Minister for Magic, understood the arithmetic of attendance better than any wizard alive. And so the men and women he could trust were here, robed in plum, leaning their elbows on the rails, and the men and women he could not trust had been sent owls that said regretfully that the session had been moved. The owls had told the truth. The session had been moved. It had been moved to a Tuesday, to the morning after the Wigtown match, to a slot no honest schedule would have built. At the center of the floor in the chain chair sat Tessa Crowley. The chains were a courtesy the room extended to everyone, guilty or not, the way a butcher's hook is extended to everything that comes through the door. She was 31. She had been a healer at St. Mungo's for 9 years on the 4th floor, spell damage, the ward where they brought the people the war had broken and never finished breaking. She had small, competent hands, and she kept them folded in her lap, and she watched Harry with the particular patience of a person who has already decided how the story ends and is only waiting to be polite about it. "You may continue, Mr. Potter," said the interrogator. The interrogator was Dolores Umbridge. She had a new title every 18 months, the way some people had new robes, and the current one was Director of the Office of Wizarding Integrity, which meant nothing and permitted everything. She sat slightly above the floor in a chair upholstered the precise pink of a wound that would not close. When she spoke, she smiled, because she had learned long ago that a smile was the cheapest form of armor and the law let you wear as much of it as you liked. "Thank you," Harry said. "I'll continue." He did not raise his voice. He had learned that trick the slow way in rooms like this, watching better men shout themselves hoarse against stone that had been enchanted to absorb conviction the way sand absorbs water. The Wisengamot's chamber was old, older than the Ministry that squatted on top of it. The acoustics had been laid by someone who wanted passion to die 3 feet from the mouth that made it and reason to carry, because reason could be answered and passion could only be feared. Harry had spent 2 years learning the building. He knew which stones listened. He stood on the one that listened best, and he spoke to it gently. "The Crown's case," he said, "rests on a single claim. That on the night of the 11th of May, the defendant removed a sealed file from the Department of Mysteries and delivered its contents to the press. The file was classified under the Secrets and Securities Act. Its disclosure, the Crown says, endangered the public. For this, Tessa Crowley faces 15 years in Azkaban." He let that sit. "I'm going to show you that every load-bearing word of that sentence is false. Not arguable, false. And I'm going to do it with the Crown's own evidence, because I find I no longer trust my own." A ripple along the plum bench. Somewhere up in the dark, a quill scratched, recording the contempt for later use. "Exhibit 1, Harry said, "the access ledger of the Department of Mysteries for the night of the 11th. The ledger unrolled itself in the air, summoned from the Crown's table a long, pale tongue of parchment with names down its left margin and times down its right. It was a beautiful object. The Department of Mysteries did not trust people, which made it the only honest institution in the building, and so it wrote down everyone who passed its doors and could not be made to forget." Harry walked beneath the floating record and tapped a line with his wand. The line brightened. "Tessa Crowley," he read, "entered the 9th level at 11:04, left at 11:41, 37 minutes. He moved his wand down the column. "Now. The file in question lives in Vault Subsidiary 4, behind a Jamina ward, a blood lock keyed to 3 unspeakables, and a door that does not open for anyone whose name is not already inside it." He looked up at the bench. "Tessa Crowley is a healer. She was on the 9th level for 37 minutes to treat an unspeakable named Caradoc Pike, who had been splinched during a containment failure and was bleeding into his own lungs. I have his discharge note. I have the duty log. I have the splinch itself preserved, which you may smell if you like. It is not pleasant." He let his wand drop. "She never went near Vault Subsidiary 4. She couldn't have. The door would not have known her. And yet the file was disclosed," Umbridge said pleasantly. "The file was disclosed," Harry agreed, "by someone whose name the door did know. That is a different sentence, Director, and it points at a different chair." He had practiced not looking at the gallery when he said things like that. The trick was to look at the bench, because the bench was where the verdict lived and the gallery was where the audience lived, and a man who played to the audience had already lost the bench. He looked at the bench. He watched the line of plum-robed faces, and he read them as he had taught himself to read them, not for what they thought, which was nothing, but for what they had been told to do, which was everything. They had been told to convict. He could see it sitting on them like weather. "Exhibit 2, he said, because the only answer to weather was to keep walking. The article. It appeared above the floor, an enlargement of a single column of the Daily Prophet from the 12th of May, the morning after. Unnamed source WRNS, he is not gone. Beneath the headline, 412 words. Harry knew the count because he had read them more times than he would admit, looking for the seam, the place where a lie had been stitched into a truth, and he had not found it because there was no lie in it. That was the part the room could not survive, and so the room had decided not to hear. The article claims, Harry said, that the dark wizard known as Voldemort survived the Battle of the Seven Towers, that a fragment of him endured. That the Department of Mysteries has known this for 3 years, has tracked the fragment, has watched it gather strength in a place it will not name, and has classified every word of it so that the public would continue to believe the war was won. He looked at the bench. The Crown's position is that this is a lie so dangerous that the woman who supposedly leaked it must spend 15 years among the Dementors. I want to be very precise about the Crown's position because it is a remarkable one. The Crown is not arguing that the article is false. Read the indictment. It argues that the article is secret. Those are not the same crime. One of them is treason, the other is journalism. The ministry has charged Tessa Crowley with journalism and asked for treason's price. Mr. Potter, Umbridge's voice came out sugared and slow. Are you suggesting that the contents of that article are true? And there it was, the door she had not meant to open opened. He had spent 6 weeks maneuvering her toward it, feeding the prosecution a defense that looked like it was about access logs and healer's notes, so that the only way to close the trap was to ask the question whose answer detonated the building. He could lie. He understood that with great clarity, standing on the stone that listened. He could say no, of course not, the article was reckless fiction, and Tessa Crowley would still go to Azkaban, but the ministry would not have to stand in the wreckage of its own lie. And somewhere in the gathering dark, a thing that had once worn the name Voldemort would continue to grow fat on the silence, and the next 11-year-old to step onto the Hogwarts Express would step onto it with no warning at all. He could buy her a smaller sentence with a larger one for everyone else. That was the trade the room was offering. It offered the trade to everyone eventually. It was very patient. Yes, Harry said, I'm suggesting they're true. I'm not suggesting it. I have the file. The chamber did the thing chambers do when a sentence lands wrong. It went still in the wrong direction, an indrawn stillness, 50 pairs of lungs deciding at once not to be heard breathing. Up in the high seats in the deepest of the blue shadow where the minister sat so that no portrait could ever capture his expression, something moved. A hand lifting, a signal. I have the file, Harry said again, into the stillness, because 3 years ago I was the Auror assigned to verify the department's findings before the department decided its findings were inconvenient and reassigned me to the cataloging of confiscated cauldrons. I read it. I copied it, which was illegal, and I have kept the copy, which is more illegal, and I am telling you under oath that the only false thing in that article is the suggestion that the source was Tessa Crowley. She didn't leak it. He turned slowly until he faced the high dark where the minister sat. Someone needed a leak to have happened so that the truth could be reframed as a crime instead of a fact. You didn't try her for telling a lie. You tried her for letting a truth escape, and then you went looking for someone small enough to hang it on. She treats spell damage on the 4th floor. She holds the hands of people your war broke. She was convenient. That is enough, said the minister. Cassius Selwyn rarely spoke in his own courtrooms. It was beneath the office, and more to the point it was dangerous, because a minister who argued could be argued with, and a minister who only ruled could not. He spoke now because Harry had made silence cost more than speech, and Selwyn, whatever else he was, could read a ledger. He leaned forward out of the shadow until the blue torchlight found the long, pale planes of his face. He was 60 and looked 40 in the way of men who have arranged for other people to do their aging. Mr. Potter, the minister said, you have given this chamber a great deal of theater, access logs, a splinched lung which I will thank you not to produce. A copy of a classified document which, by your own admission, you stole, and which I notice you have not actually placed in evidence. A pause, waited, gracious. You have not placed it in evidence, I think, because it does not exist. You are a famous man telling a frightened story to frighten people, and you are using a dead war to do it. There is no fragment, there is no shadow gathering in the dark. The Dark Lord is 12 years gone, and the only thing his name does now is what you are using it for, which is to make children afraid so that men like you can promise to protect them. He sat back. Produce the file or sit down. It was, Harry would think later, a genuinely excellent move. He could admire it the way you admire a knife that has just gone into you cleanly. If he produced the file, he handed the ministry the only physical proof of its 3-year cover-up, and the Department of Mysteries would have it unmade and the witnesses unmade and Harry himself charged before the ink dried. If he did not produce it, he was a famous man telling a frightened story. Selwyn had built a box with 2 doors and both of them opened onto Azkaban, so Harry did not reach for either door. He had spent 2 years learning that the only way out of a box built by a clever man is to refuse the premise the box is built on. I'm not going to produce it, he said. You're right that I'd be a fool to. You'd have it in the Vale's gullet by sundown and Tessa with it. He turned back to the bench, to the rows of plum, and he spoke to them now, not to the minister, because the minister was already decided and the bench was where the small remaining doubt still lived in 2 or 3 faces that had not entirely sold themselves yet. I'm telling you instead what you already know. Every one of you has heard it, in the corridors, at the parties, in the long pauses when somebody senior changes the subject too fast. You know the department reclassified the tower's reports. You know 3 Aurors who asked the wrong questions got transferred to the wrong jobs. You know why this trial was scheduled for a Tuesday morning when half your colleagues are at the seaside. You don't need my file, you have your own memory. I'm asking you to convict on it, convict the truth, acquit the healer. She didn't do this. For a moment, one of the faces on the bench, a witch he did not know old, with a Ravenclaw severity to the set of her shoulders, looked down at Tessa Crowley in the chain chair, and something in the look was almost a question. Then Umbridge said, "We will vote," and the question closed like a fist. They voted with their wands. It was a tidy system, a lit tip for guilt, a dark tip for innocence, and the interrogators quill totting up the constellation without anyone having to be seen to do anything. Harry watched the tears fill with light. He counted, because counting was the only thing the room had left him that it could not take. 29 wands lit, 3 stayed dark. The Ravenclaw witch's wand stayed dark, and Harry marked her, the only honest light in the room being the one that refused to shine. Tessa Crowley, Umbridge read from her quill's tally with the warmth of a woman announcing a raffle. This body finds you guilty of the unlawful disclosure of secured information under the Act. You are sentenced to 15 years in Azkaban Fortress to be served at the Crown's discretion. The smile widened by a precise increment. The Crown reserves the question of the kiss. Tessa Crowley did not weep. She had worked 9 years on the 4th floor, and she had used up her capacity for being surprised by what wizards did to each other a long time ago. She looked at Harry, and her competent hands unfolded in her lap, and she said in a clear voice that the listening stone carried perfectly so that everyone heard it whether they wanted to or not. "It's all right, Harry. You tried it the right way. The right way." He would remember those 4 words a great deal in the months that followed. He would remember them when he tore the doors off Azkaban. He would remember them at the founding, with the wards of Britain answering to his hand. He would remember them at the very end, standing over the unmade thing that had wanted his throne, with the dawn coming up gray over a country that no longer had a ministry. You tried it the right way, a thing the room had never once intended to let work. The box had never owned a door. The Aurors came down the aisle to take her. Harry knew 2 of them. He had trained with one. His old yearmate would not meet his eyes, and that silence was its own kind of confession. He stood on the stone that listened, and he let them take her, because there were 40 Aurors in the building and one of him, and a fight here would end with Tessa dead in the crossfire and the cover-up sealed in his blood, and he was not, whatever else they would later call him, a fool. He let them take her. He memorized the weight of letting them. That was the morning the patience went out of him. Not the anger had been there for years, a banked thing, kept low and fed carefully because anger spent loud was anger wasted. What went out of him in Courtroom 10 was the patience. The belief, held against all evidence, the way a man holds a habit, that the building could be made to work if you only learned it well enough, argued it cleanly enough, loved the law more than the men who'd captured it. He had learned it. He had argued it clean. And the building had looked at a clean argument in a frightened country and a true word loose in the dark, and it had chosen the lie because the lie kept the right people in the deep blue shadow and the truth did not. You could not reform a thing that worked exactly as intended. The ministry was not broken. That was the discovery that emptied him out, standing there while they walked Tessa Crowley up the aisle. A broken thing wanted fixing. The ministry was operating at peak performance. It had taken a true warning of returning catastrophe and converted it smoothly, without a single jammed gear, into a 15-year sentence for the one person in the room who held strangers' hands while they died. That was not failure. That was the machine doing its job, and you did not fix a machine that was doing its job. You decided whether the job was one you could allow to continue. He decided in Courtroom 10 that it was not. 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk. The atrium of the ministry had been rebuilt 3 times in Harry's lifetime, each version grander than the last, each one paid for by a budget that the Wisengamot had been told was for orphans. The current incarnation favored black marble and gold, and the Fountain of Magical Brethren had been replaced after the war by a monument called the Triumph of Order. A 40-foot wizard in robes, wand raised, and gathered at his feet in attitudes of gratitude the lesser figures the sculptor had thought to include. A goblin kneeling, a centaur bowing, a house elf reaching up, a witch in healer's robes, hands folded. The plaque said the figures represented the harmony of magical society under wise governance. Harry had always thought the harmony looked a great deal like a boot. He crossed the marble toward the lifts, and he was nearly to them when a voice he knew called his name in the bright social register people used in that building when they meant to be overheard. Harry, Harry, wait. Percy Weasley, in robes a careful half-shade less plum than the Wisengamot, hurrying across the marble with a folder under his arm and an expression assembled for the occasion. Percy had risen. Percy was senior undersecretary now, which meant he carried Selwyn's folders and absorbed Selwyn's mistakes, and he had perfected a way of looking simultaneously apologetic and immovable that Harry suspected took real work in front of a mirror. That was a difficult morning. "I want you to know the minister bears you no ill will. Passions run high. These things are understood." "Are they?" Harry said. "You're a war hero. That carries weight. It buys you a great deal of latitude that another man wouldn't have." Percy lowered his voice into the confidential. "Which is why I'd hate to see you spend it. The file, Harry, the one you mentioned, the minister is willing to consider it a matter of high feeling of theater, provided it stays theater. If it were to become a real object in real circulation, that latitude would close, very fast, for you and for anyone standing near you when it did." He glanced fractionally at nothing, which meant he was thinking of his father, of Arthur, who still ran his small, honest office 2 floors down and had still not been promoted in 20 years precisely because he was honest. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand you perfectly, Percy. You're telling me the threat. You're doing it kindly, which I'll remember, because most people in this building wouldn't bother with the kindness." Harry studied him. Percy had not always been this. There had been a version of Percy who memorized cauldron bottom regulations because he believed with his whole earnest heart that rules were how the weak were protected from the strong. The building had found that belief and put it to work. It was very good at that. It took the thing that was best in a person and bent it into a leash. Tell the minister I understood the threat, and tell him I said the file isn't the danger. The danger is that everyone in that courtroom already knew the truth and voted against it anyway. You can't classify that. It's already out. It's in every one of you. Percy's assembled expression did not change, but something behind it went very still, the stillness of a man who has heard a thing he will have to report and would rather not have heard. I'll convey that you're upset. Do, Harry said and stepped into the lift and let the golden grill rattle shut between them. 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk Hermione was waiting in the visitors' anteroom on level 2, where she was not supposed to be, because she was a junior counsel in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and junior counsels did not attend the trials of the politically inconvenient unless they wished to stop being junior counsels. She had come anyway. She had a stack of case files held to her chest like a breastplate and she had been crying and had stopped, and she rounded on him the moment the lift opened with the particular fury she reserved for institutions she still loved. We appeal, she said. Immediately. The access ledger alone is grounds, the doorward evidence is unimpeachable. No appellate panel in the world upholds a conviction where the defendant physically could not have committed the act. We take it to the full Weisengamot, we force a quorum, we make them seat all 50, we get it into the legal press where Selwyn can't bury it on a Tuesday. There are still good people on that bench, Harry. I've appeared before some of them, they're not all bought, and if we make the law loud enough that they have to be seen choosing, some of them will choose right. She was talking fast, as she did when she was building a fortress out of procedure because procedure was the only ground she trusted. It works. The system works if you make it work, it just needs people who won't stop pushing. Hermione, don't, she knew that tone. She had been hearing it edge into his voice for 2 years, the flatness that came over him when he had finished arguing with a thing and started weighing it. Don't do the thing where you've decided. I can see you've decided something. Tell me it's the appeal. 3 wands stayed dark, he said. Out of 32 cast, I counted. One of them was Griselda Marchbanks, who is 90-something and afraid of nobody because she's outlived everybody worth fearing. The other 2 were people who'll deny it if you ask. That's the system working, Hermione. That's the system at full strength against the cleanest case either of us will ever try, with the truth so obvious that the minister himself had to come down out of the shadow to lie about it directly. 3 dark wands. We don't lose the appeal because the law is against us. We lose it because the law is a building and the building is owned and the owner schedules our hearings for Tuesdays. So we change the owner, she lifted her chin. That's what an election is, that's what reform is. You build a coalition, you win seats. You take the Weisengamot back vote by vote. It's slow and it's ugly and it's how every decent thing in the history of governance has ever been won. It is not glamorous, Harry, it is committee work, and I'm very, very good at committee work, and I am asking you to do the slow, boring, necessary thing with me instead of whatever fast, terrible thing is happening behind your eyes right now. He looked at her for a long moment. He loved her in the way you love the person who has been arguing with you since you were 11, which is to say without reservation, and frequently while wanting to throttle her. And he knew that everything she had just said was true, in a world that did not have a fragment of Voldemort thickening in the dark on a 3-year clock, in a world where the ministry's rot was the ordinary rot of comfortable men, and not the active malignancy of men who had decided that an honest catastrophe was less useful to them than a profitable lie. In that world, the slow, boring, necessary thing was right, and Hermione was the best of all possible people to do it, and he would have followed her into the committee work and been glad of it. They did not live in that world. He had read the file, he knew the clock. How long, he said quietly, do you think reform takes? Be honest. You've done the math, you always do the math. A coalition, seats, a working majority, the repeal of the Secrets Act, the unmaking of the department's classification regime, the trials of the men who built it. Honestly, how many years? She did not answer for a moment because she had done the math, and the math was the one part of any argument she would not lie about, even to win it. 15, she said, 20 if nothing goes wrong. It grows in the dark for 15 years while we win seats. He said it gently because it was not her fault, and because the gentleness was the only mercy the situation contained. There's a thing in the world right now, Hermione, that murdered its way to the edge of conquering us once, and the only reason it didn't is that a lot of people I loved are dead. It survived, it's coming back. And the institution whose entire purpose is to stop it has decided to imprison the people who say so because saying so is bad for the institution. We don't have 15 years. The thing in the dark does not care about our quorum. It is not waiting for our coalition. And I am done. I am done learning the building. I learned it. I learned it better than the men who own it. And this morning I used everything I learned to make the cleanest argument of my life, and the building looked at it and ate it and asked for the kiss. He shook his head once. The right way doesn't work because they built the right way. They built the door and the lock and the Tuesday. I'm not going to keep walking through a door they built to be walked through. I'm going to take the building down. The case files were still pressed to her chest. She was very pale. Take it down and put what in its place. It was, he would think afterward, the only question that had ever mattered, and she was the only person who would have asked it first, before the how, before the danger, before any of it. Not can you, not should you, what goes in the hole. She had read the same histories he had. She knew that the graveyard of every revolution was paved with people who had been very clear about what they were tearing down and entirely vague about what came after, and that the vagueness was where the new tyrant always grew. "I don't know yet," he said, which was the truth and the truest thing he had said all day. "But I know it can't have a Courtroom 10 in it, and I know it can't have a Tuesday. And I know that whatever it is, the goblins and the centaurs and the house elves are going to be standing up in it instead of kneeling at the bottom of a fountain. That's three things. I'll build out from three things. That's not a constitution, that's a grievance with good production values. Then help me make it a constitution." He said it without weight, as if he were asking her to check a citation, because he had learned that the largest requests landed best when you carried them lightly. "You're right that I'll get it wrong. You're right that I'm the exact kind of person who shouldn't be trusted with this, the kind with a cause and a body count behind him in a country that already half worships him. You know all that better than I do. You've been telling me since we were 12. So come and be the person who tells me, be the Dark Wand, be Marchbanks. I'm not asking you to believe in tearing it down. I'm asking you to refuse to let me become the thing I'm tearing down. That's a job. It might be the only job that matters, and there's nobody else alive I'd trust to do it." She looked at him for a long time in the ugly anteroom with its institutional carpet and its portrait of a former minister who had died comfortable, and he watched her do the thing he had watched her do 100 times, the thing that had kept all of them alive through a war. Take a future she did not want, turn it over, examine the joins, and decide whether it would hold weight. "If you start scheduling things for Tuesdays," she said at last, unsteadily, "I will end you myself." "I know you will," Harry said. "That's the point of you." Eight spoked asterisk, eight spoked asterisk, eight spoked asterisk. He did not go home, he went down. Below the lowest level the public knew, below the courtrooms, below even the ninth where the unspeakables kept their long thoughts, the ministry rested on something older than itself. Every great building of magic did. You could not lay a foundation in a place thick with old power without the power getting into the stone, and the men who had raised the first ministry centuries gone had not built on empty ground. They had built on the confluence, the place where the lays that ran under Britain crossed, the deep knot from which the wards of the whole island were hung. The ministry did not generate its authority. It sat on the spigot. That was the secret nobody classified because almost nobody knew it. The minister for magic ruled because the wardstone of Britain answered to the office, and the office answered to whoever held the building. Harry knew it because he had spent 2 years finding it. He had not gone looking for a weapon. He had gone looking at first only for understanding, as he had always gone looking, taking the world apart to see what held it together, because the alternative was to be one more wizard who waved a wand and never asked why it worked. And the asking had carried him down, through the law into the magic the law was a clumsy copy of, through the department's classifications into the things the classifications were built to hide, until he had stood in a chamber no living wizard was supposed to find and put his hand on the cold root of the country. He went there now. He did not touch it. He only stood in the dark with the deep stone humming under his palm an inch away, and he let himself understand, fully and without flinching, the size of the thing he had decided to do that morning in Courtroom 10. In his pocket, wrapped in a square of his father's cloak, sat a small black stone turned 3 times in his hand on a night 2 years gone, and a ring's worth of the most dangerous metal in the world. In a holster at his wrist sat a wand of elder, gnarled and ungenerous, that had come to him not because he wanted it, but because it had run out of better options. And folded into his coat, weightless, was the third thing, the cloak itself, his father's, his grandfather's, older than any of them, the thing that had hidden a Potter from death's own gaze for 600 years. He had not assembled them. That was the part nobody would ever believe afterward when they made him into either a saint or a monster, depending on who was telling it. He had not gone questing for the hallows. They had come to him the way debts come to an honest man, one at a time, unasked, until he looked up one day and found himself holding all three and understood with the cold clarity that had replaced his patience what holding all three meant, not immortality. He had no interest in immortality. He had seen what the hunger for it did, had spent a war killing the pieces of a man who had wanted nothing else. The hallows did not make you live forever. They made you the one wizard whom death would treat as a sovereign rather than a subject, which meant the things death owned, the cold things, the dementors that fed on the warmth of the living, and the veil that took the dead, and the whole gray machinery of ending that the ministry had captured and turned into a prison and a punishment and a Tuesday. Those things would answer him. Had begun to answer him. He had felt it for months now, the way a dementor would slow and turn its hooded face toward him in a corridor, uncertain, the way a captive animal grows uncertain when it sensed that the keeper's keys have changed hands. That was the power nobody had measured because nobody had known to look. They saw the war hero, the famous boy, grown into a quiet, stubborn man who tried cases he could not win for clients nobody else would take. They did not see that the quiet man had become, by patience and grief and an unforgivable amount of reading, the most dangerous wizard in Britain, and that the only thing that had kept him from being dangerous was that he had still believed until this morning in the building. He took his hand away from the deep stone. He was not ready to touch it. When he touched it, it would be to take it, and you did not take the foundation of a country on a bad morning out of grief for one good woman. You took it cold, you took it ready. You took it with something built to put in the hole so that you did not become one more clever man very clear about what he was tearing down and vague about the after. Not yet, he said to the stone or to himself or to the small black weight in his pocket that had a way of warming when he made up his mind. Soon, not yet. He climbed back toward the surface. On level 9 in the dim, a Dementor drifted across the far end of the corridor, one of the dozen the Ministry kept stabled there for reasons the budget called security and Harry called a threat with a uniform. It was gliding away from him, hood toward the dark. Then it stopped. The cold that rode in front of it, the cold that pulled the joy out of a man and showed him his worst memory by way of greeting, washed down the corridor and reached Harry and broke against him like a wave against a stone that had decided not to care, and the Dementor turned. Slowly. The way a hound turns when the wrong man whistles. It hung in the air at the corridor's end, hooded face toward him, and it did not advance and it did not flee, and after a moment it sank toward the floor in a motion that, if it had been a man, you would have had to call a bow. Harry looked at it for a moment. He did not raise his wand. He did not need to, and they both knew it, and that was the whole of the new arithmetic in one cold corridor. Soon, he told it and walked on, and the thing that had spent a century being the Ministry's terror folded itself smaller against the wall to let him pass. Eight-spoked asterisk, eight-spoked asterisk, eight-spoked asterisk. He surfaced into the London night through a red telephone box that smelled of other people's cigarettes, and he stood for a moment on the wet pavement among the muggles, who hurried past him in the rain with their umbrellas and their headphones and their complete and blessed ignorance of the fact that a man had just decided 300 feet below their feet to end the government that secretly ruled the magical half of their island. None of them looked at him. He found that he liked them enormously for it. They were the after, in a way, 11 million muggles in this city alone, governing themselves with their loud, ugly, arguable institutions, their courts you could appeal to on a day that was not a Tuesday, their press you could not classify, their leaders you could throw out without a war. They got a great deal of it wrong. They got more of it right than the Wisengamot, and there were 40 times more of them, and the difference was that nobody owned the spigot. That was a thing he could learn from. He stored it next to the three things from the courtroom, the goblins standing and the centaurs standing and the elves standing, and he began walking through the muggle rain to do the slow, cold work that would eat the next year of his life. Not the dreaming of the empire, which was easy, but the engineering of it, the load paths, the question Hermione had asked that no revolutionary had ever answered well. What goes in the hole? He did not have it yet. He had three things and a grievance with good production values. But he had something the building did not, which was that he had stopped believing in the building, and a man who has stopped believing in the thing everyone else is afraid of has already taken the first stone out of its wall. He thought of Tessa Crowley going north tonight in a windowless boat to a fortress in a cold sea, sentenced for truth, with the kiss held in reserve over her head like a sword on a thread. He had told her he would get her out. He had said it quietly in the moment they took her, 2 words under the listening stone, and she had not believed him, and she had been right not to, because no man could get her out of Azkaban. But a man was the old arithmetic. He turned up his collar against the rain and walked toward the bright, dirty river, and somewhere far north the Dementors stirred at their posts above a sleeping prison and turned their hooded faces all together toward the south as if they had heard a whistle on a wind that had not yet begun to blow. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The first crack. The drawing room at number 12 Grimmauld Place had been a war room before, and it took to the work again in the way an old dog takes to a familiar walk. Harry had cleared the long table of the Black family's accumulated cruelty, the silver snuff boxes that bit and the candlesticks that whispered slurs, and laid out instead 3 objects. A back issue of the Daily Prophet, a single galleon, and a thin black book of law so old its spine had been resewn with dragon gut. He stood at the head of the table with his hands flat on the wood and explained to 4 people why he was not going to raise an army. Everyone who fights the Ministry fights it the same way, he said, and they all lose the same way, so let's start by not doing that. They gather wands, they find a field, they meet the Aurors in the field, and they're outnumbered and outfunded and outwarded, and they die bravely, and the Prophet calls them terrorists, and the country agrees because the country only ever heard one side. That's the whole history of resistance in magical Britain. It's a graveyard with good intentions in it. He tapped the newspaper. I'm not raising an army. Armies lose to the Ministry. I'm going after the 3 things that make the Ministry stronger than an army, which is what it actually is and which is why everyone keeps losing to it. Go on then. Draco Malfoy sat at the far end of the table with his boots up on a Black family footstool, because he had decided that the way to survive being in a room full of people who had every reason to hate him was to behave as though he owned it. He was thinner than he had been at school, with gray coming in early at his temples, and he had arrived that morning uninvited with a leather folder under his arm and the words, "I assume you'll want someone who knows where the bodies are actually filed." Harry had let him in. Hermione had not spoken to him yet, which from Hermione was a kind of armed truce. 3 things, you're going to make this dramatic, I can tell you've got the face on. Money, story, and law, Harry said, that's the whole spell. A government is a story people believe, backed by money people need, enforced by law people fear. Pull any one and it wobbles. Pull all 3 at once and it doesn't fall over so much as discover it was never standing. He looked around the table, Hermione with her arms folded and 3 colors of ink already on her fingers, Neville Longbottom, broad and still, who had said almost nothing and was therefore listening hardest, Luna Lovegood, who had her chair turned slightly toward the window and appeared to be watching something in the garden that was not there, and Draco with his boots up. The Ministry's money is goblin money. It has been since 1066. Their story is The Daily Prophet and The Wizarding Wireless, both of which Selwyn owns through 3 layers of nominees that took me a year to unstitch. And their law is a building full of bot judges sitting on a foundation they didn't build and don't understand. 3 things, I have a way at all 3. I wanted you to hear them together so you'd understand it isn't madness, it's bookkeeping. It's treason, Hermione said, but she said it the way you read out a line item, not the way you raise an objection, and Harry marked the difference. It's treason, he agreed. Bookkeeping and treason aren't exclusive, ask the goblins. Neville had been turning his grandfather's wand over in his big, careful hands while Harry talked, and he set it down now, flat on the table, in the way you put down a tool when you have decided to use it. You've told us what you're pulling down, he said. Money, story, law. Draco asked what goes in the hole and you danced, so I'll ask the part I care about. When the building comes down, it comes down on people, clerks, records, witches, the wizard who runs the lifts and has done for 40 years and never bought a judge in his life. What happens to them? Because I've watched one war already make orphans out of the wrong children, and I'm not standing up to make another one. He held Harry's eyes. Neville did not blink in arguments. It was one of the things the last war had welded into him. That's my price for the wand on the table. You tell me the small people survive the big idea, or you do this without me. They survive, Harry said. That's not a kindness, Neville, it's the whole point. The wizard on the lifts keeps his job because the lifts still need running on the day after as much as the day before. I'm not burning a country down. I'm changing whose name the wards answer to and whose neck the law sits hardest on. If I do it right, the clerk and the records which notice it mostly as a better Tuesday. He paused. If I do it wrong, you're right and you should stop me, and I'm telling you in front of witnesses that stopping me is a job I'm assigning you on purpose. You and Hermione, one of you on the law, one of you on the bodies. Luna had turned from the window. She did not seem to have heard the argument and proved, as she usually did, that she had heard all of it. There's an empty chair, she observed, of the place at the table that no one had filled, the place where in every plan they had ever made in this house since they were children, a red-headed boy had sat and disagreed cheerfully with all of it. Ron would have sat there and said you were both being mad and then helped anyway. He isn't here. She said it without accusation in the plain tone she kept for true and difficult things. His father runs an honest office 2 floors under the men you're going to ruin. You should think about that chair before it's full of someone you'll have to fight. Harry looked at the empty chair for a moment and did not answer because there was no answer that was not also a wound, and he had learned not to dress wounds with words. Noted, he said, which was the most honest thing available. Money tomorrow. Get some sleep. The next part of this we do where the goblins can see us, and the goblins judge tired men harshly. 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk you did not summon the goblins. That was the first thing the ministry had never learned in 900 years of trying, and the reason every treaty between wizard and goblin read to a goblin like a confession. You requested an audience, and you requested it correctly in writing on your own behalf and not the Crown-S, and you waited, and if the request was judged worthy the answer came back not by owl but by the simple fact of a door in Gringotts that had not been there before. The door let Harry into the deep bank 2 nights later alone because he had requested it alone, and the goblins respected nothing so much as a man who arrived at a dangerous place without his friends. The vault levels he knew, the marble and the carts and the dragons. He had robbed this bank once, which the goblins also respected. In the strange way they respected almost everything except the people they did business with daily. Below the vaults the bank went on into chambers cut when the Romans were rumor, and at the bottom of it, in a hall whose ceiling he could not find with his eyes, the goblin nation kept its court. Ragnarok V received him from a seat of unworked stone, because thrones of gold were a wizard's idea of importance and the goblins found the idea funny. He was small and very old and his eyes were the color of old coins, and he let Harry stand in the long silence that the hall imposed on everyone, the silence that was the goblin's first and best negotiator, before he said in the trade tongue that was the only language goblins would conduct business in, the wizard who returned the sword. I returned what wasn't mine, Harry said. It was made by Ragnarok I. It answered Gryffindor only as long as Gryffindor lived. The ministry calls it a Hogwarts heirloom. The ministry is wrong about most things, but it's especially wrong about that. A sound went through the assembled goblins that was not quite speech, a dry click of many tongues, the goblin equivalent of a room sitting up. Ragnarok's coin-colored eyes did not change, but something moved behind them, the recalculation of a creature who had expected to be flattered and had instead been agreed with. You did not come about a sword, Ragnarok said. No, I came to tell you the Ministry of Magic is going to fall and to ask which side of that you'd like to be standing on when it does. I'll tell you why it's going to fall and you can judge whether I'm a fool. Then I'll tell you what I'm offering and you can judge whether I'm worth the risk. Then you'll decide and I'll abide by it, because a treaty you sign under flattery isn't worth the goat you'd slaughter to seal it, and we both know it. Ragnarok inclined his head a fraction, which from a goblin king was effusive. Speak. So Harry told him not the speech he would have given a wizard. He gave the goblins the ledger. He laid out the ministry's debts to Gringotts, which he had spent a year reconstructing from the 3 layers of nominees. The borrowing against future tax that Selwyn's government had done to pay for the marble atrium and the monument with the kneeling goblin at its feet. The way the Crown's solvency was now a polite fiction that depended entirely on Gringotts never calling the loans. He laid out the statute clauses by which the ministry had over centuries stripped the goblins of the right to carry wands, to own land above ground, to testify in a Wisengamot court as anything but property in dispute. He did it in numbers because numbers were the only poetry a goblin trusted, and he watched the hall do the arithmetic alongside him and arrive, goblin by goblin, at the same total he had. The ministry owes you more than it can pay, Harry said, and it has spent 900 years writing laws to make sure you can never collect. That's not a debtor, that's a thief who's also borrowed your savings. I'm proposing you stop extending him credit. And in the ruin that follows, Ragnarok said, you would have us trust a second wizard who also makes promises. No, trust isn't on offer, I wouldn't insult you with it. I'm offering a contract in goblin form sealed in goblin law, which I'll let your law bind me to in any way you find sufficient, including the old ways, the ones the statute made illegal because your old ways actually worked. Harry reached into his coat and laid on the unworked stone before the throne a single sheet of parchment handwritten, that he had labored over for 3 weeks with Hermione reading every clause aloud to find the lie in it. When the ministry falls, what stands in its place recognizes the goblin nation as a sovereign people, not subjects, not brethren at the foot of a fountain. A nation with its own law on its own land, with the right to carry what it forges, to testify as itself, to hold its own debts and collect them. In exchange, Gringotts calls the crown's loans on a day I'll name and backs the new order's currency, and we trade as equals forever after, which we have never once done in 900 years, and which you have wanted for 900 years, and which no wizard has ever offered you because no wizard ever needed you badly enough to mean it. He stepped back from the parchment. I need you badly enough to mean it. That's the only honest reason to trust me, so it's the only one I'll give you. I'm not good, I'm desperate and consistent. For your purposes, those are better. The silence after that was the longest yet. Goblins did not gasp and did not cheer, they computed. Harry stood in the cold stone hall under a ceiling he could not see and let them compute, and did not fill the silence, because filling silence was a wizard's weakness and he had trained it out of himself in Courtroom 10. At last Ragnarok the Fifth picked up the parchment in one long-fingered hand and read it through slowly twice, the way a jeweler reads a stone looking for the flaw that proves it false. He did not find one. You have written here, he said, a clause that binds you personally, not the order you build, you by name, by blood. If the order you found breaks this treaty, the breaking falls on your own life, forfeit to our law with no appeal and no ransom. Wizards do not sign such clauses. Wizards sign for their offices and leave their persons free so that they may break their word and call it policy. Why did you write it? Because you'd have known the treaty was worthless without it, Harry said. And because I'm trying to build a thing where the man at the top is bound harder than the people at the bottom instead of the reverse, which is the entire disease I'm trying to cut out. You're not just my creditor, Ragnarok, you're the first test of whether I mean it. If I'll bind my own life to keep faith with goblins, the wizards watching will understand I'll bind it to keep faith with them. You're not a line item, you're the cornerstone. I'd rather you knew that going in. Ragnarok the Fifth was 1100 years old by the goblins' reckoning, which counted differently, and he had watched wizards lie to his people across the whole of that span in every dialect of self-interest the language possessed, and he knew the taste of a true thing the way a man who has been poisoned often knows the taste of clean water. He set the parchment down. He drew a knife of dark metal across his own palm without looking at it, and held the bleeding hand out across the stone, which was a thing no goblin king had done to a wizard since before the ministry was built. Bleed then, master of the sword's return, he said, and we will see whether your blood keeps better faith than your kind's ink ever has. Harry drew the elder wand, opened his own palm with its tip, and took the goblin king's hand in the dark, and the old magic closed over the both of them with a weight that the hall felt and approved, a sound of many dry tongues clicking once in unison like a door deciding to open. The Ministry of Magic had lost its bank and did not yet know it, and would not know it until the day Harry named, and by then there would be nothing left to do about it but fall. 8-spoked asterisk, 8-spoked asterisk, 8-spoked asterisk. The story was harder than the money, because money was held by goblins who were rational, and story was held by frightened people who were not. The Daily Prophet operated out of a building on Diagon Alley that pretended to be a newspaper and was in fact a faucet. Copy went in at the top, where editors who valued their careers shaped it, and truth came out at the bottom, already the right shape, and the whole apparatus was owned through Selwyn's 3 nominees by Selwyn. You could not buy it, it was not for sale to anyone the minister had not chosen. You could not bomb it, that made you the terrorist the next morning's edition needed you to be. Harry had thought about the Prophet for a long time and concluded that the answer to a captured faucet was not to seize the faucet. It was to remind everyone that the water came from a well, and that the well was older than the faucet, and that the law that built the faucet had also carelessly left the well in the public domain. The Wizarding Wireless Network, he told the War Room the night after Gringotts, broadcasts under a charter, the Charter S in the Black Book. He opened the thin dragon gut volume to a page he had marked. Granted in 1927, when the ministry was too cheap to build its own transmitter and too lazy to read what it was signing. The charter gives the WWN a monopoly on magical broadcast in exchange for one obligation, which the ministry has quietly ignored since about 1931, the right of address. Any witch or wizard who has performed a service to the crown of the first magnitude as recognized by the award of the Order of Merlin First Class may demand the open channel for the space of 1 hour once in their life to address the whole of magical Britain unedited and uncensored on any matter they choose, and the WWN must yield the channel or forfeit the charter. It's never been used. Nobody who's ever held an Order of Merlin First Class has ever needed to talk over the ministry's head because they all got their medals from the ministry and liked the ministry fine. He let the book fall shut. I have an Order of Merlin First Class. They gave it to me 12 years ago. I never wanted it. I'm about to find out what it's for. Draco's boots came down off the footstool. You're going to walk into the WWN and invoke a 100-year-old clause and they're going to laugh you into the street. They're going to try, Harry agreed. Which is why I'm bringing the law in a form they can't laugh at. Hermione slid a sheaf of parchment down the table, and for the first time that week she was almost smiling because there was nothing in the world Hermione Granger loved like a procedural lever long enough to move a building. A writ, she said. Filed this afternoon in the magical Court of Common Charter, which is a real court, a dusty one that the ministry forgot exists because nobody's litigated a broadcast charter since the wireless was new. The writ asserts Harry's right of address and demands the WWN honor it within 7 days. If they refuse, the charter is forfeit by its own terms, automatically no appeal, and every other broadcaster in Britain, of which there are presently none, may apply for it. Selwyn can lean on a judge, but he can't lean on the clause. It executes itself, so he has two choices. He lets the most famous man in the country talk to the whole island unedited for an hour, or he destroys the monopoly that lets him own the only voice in the country. There's no third door. She set down her quill. I checked it 9 times. There's no third door. Draco looked at her, and something passed over his sharp, pale face that on anyone else would have been respect. That's genuinely vicious, he said. I had no idea you were vicious. Potter, did you know she was vicious? Since I was 12, Harry said. Why do you think she's the one who keeps me honest? You have to be that good at being bad to know where the line is. 8-spoked asterisk, 8-spoked asterisk. The Wizarding Wireless Network honored the right of address at 6 o'clock on the evening of the 7th day, having spent 5 of those days seeking a third door and the 6th discovering there was not one. They honored it badly and under protest. With a ministry official seated in the corner of the broadcast room holding a contempt citation he had not yet been given permission to serve, and with the understanding conveyed to Harry by 3 separate intermediaries that whatever he said into that golden horn would be the last thing he ever said as a free man. He stood in the small, bright studio with the enchanted horn in front of him, the one that carried a voice into every wireless set in Britain, into kitchens and shops and the common rooms of Hogwarts and the guardroom of Azkaban and the deep offices of the ministry itself, and he did not give a speech. A speech was what they expected. A speech was a thing the prophet could answer in the morning, could frame, could surround with experts who would explain that the famous war hero had grown unwell. So he did not give a speech. He gave them the file. He read it. He read the file he had refused to produce in Courtroom 10, the Department of Mystery's 3-year record of the fragment that had survived the Battle of the 7 Towers, the surveillance, the place it would not name, the growth. He read the reclassification orders with the signatures on them. He read the transfer notices for the 3 Aurors who had asked questions, with the dates that lined up too neatly to be anything but punishment. He read Tessa Crowley's access ledger and her healer's note and the duty log, and then he read her sentence. He read in a flat, clear, unhurried voice, the voice he had used on the stone that listened, and he did not editorialize because the facts did not need him to be angry on their behalf. They only needed to be let out of the building. My name is Harry Potter, he said, when the file was finished and 40 minutes had passed and the ministry official in the corner had gone the gray of old porridge. 12 years ago this ministry gave me a medal for ending a war. Tonight I've spent the hour that medal entitles me to telling you the war isn't over, that your government has known it wasn't over for 3 years, and that it has spent those 3 years not fighting the thing in the dark but imprisoning the people who tried to warn you about it. I'm not asking you to take my word. Everything I read tonight exists. The originals are where the Department of Mysteries keeps them, and the department will deny they exist, and you'll have to decide which is more likely. That I forged a healer's duty log and a court's own sentencing record to frighten you, or that a government which schedules its inconvenient trials for Tuesday mornings has been lying to you about whether the thing that murdered your families is dead. I think you already know. I think you've known for a while in the way you know things you're not allowed to say. He's not gone. They knew, and the building that's supposed to protect you decided you were easier to govern frightened of nothing than warned of something. He paused, one beat, the only beat he allowed himself. You're going to hear starting tomorrow that I've gone mad or dark or both. Consider who's telling you, consider that they own the telling. And then consider that for the length of 1 hour tonight you heard something the ministry could not edit, and ask yourselves why that's never been allowed to happen before. He set the horn down. The hour was not quite spent, but he had nothing left worth the rest of it, and a man who talked past his point was a man who did not trust his point. In the corner the ministry official finally received, by Patronus, the permission he had been waiting 5 days for and rose with his contempt citation, and Harry let him serve it and took the rolled parchment politely and walked out of the WWN into a diagon alley where in every lit window of every shop along the cobbles, people were standing very still beside their wireless sets, not speaking. In the way a country stands still in the half-second after it has heard a thing it cannot now unhear, the first crack does not look like much. It is only a line in the stone, fine as a hair, where before there was no line at all, but the stone knows. The stone has felt the load change, and every crack that ever brought a building down began as one hairfine line that someone in authority looked at and decided to ignore. The prophet did exactly what Harry had predicted, which was the trouble with the prophet. Its lies had become so reliable that they functioned as confirmation. Potter's breakdown, war hero SBR80's panic, the morning edition shouted, with a quote from an unnamed healer diagnosing him from a distance and a sidebar wondering delicately whether the strain of fame had finally undone the famous. It was a competent piece of work. It would have buried any ordinary man. But a country that had heard the file read aloud in his own flat, unhurried voice on a channel the ministry could not edit now had two stories to hold at once. The printed one and the heard one, and the gap between them was a place doubt could live, and doubt, once it has a place to live, does not pay rent and does not leave. By the third morning the doubt had legs. They came to Grimmauld Place in ones and twos, by routes that suggested they had thought hard about not being followed. A junior records clerk who brought, rolled in a quibbler, the original transfer orders for the three reassigned Aurors. A retired Auror 60 who had policed Diagon Alley for 30 years and had never once been told he was protecting a lie until a man said so on the wireless, and who stood in the hall turning his hat in his hands and said only, "I'd like to be useful, sir, before I'm too old to be." A house elf named Tilly, who had served a Wisengamot family for 140 years and had walked out of the house on her own 2 feet for the first time in her life after hearing, on her mistress's wireless, a wizard say that elves would stand up in whatever came next. She arrived with nothing and asked for nothing and would not leave, and Creature, who answered the door, looked at her for a long moment and then stood aside, which from Creature was a coronation. Draco read the visitor's book each evening with the attention of a man counting an enemy's cavalry. "You're getting clerks and pensioners and a runaway elf," he said on the third night, not unkindly. "Selwyn's getting nervous, which is more useful than it sounds. A confident tyrant does nothing, a nervous one overreaches. And he is nervous, Potter, I know the signs. I grew up watching my father read them in this exact kind of weather. He's already drafted an enemy of the state decree. My source in the minister's office saw it on the blotter. He's going to come for you publicly soon because the longer you stand free the more clerks defect, and a clerk is a small thing until you remember the whole building is made of them." He closed the book. "When he comes, he'll bring the Dementors. He always brings the Dementors. It's the one card the ministry's held over this country for a century, and he doesn't know yet that you've quietly bought the deck. Far from London, in a place the Department of Mysteries would not name even in its own classified file, something stirred that had not stirred in 3 years. It had been content to grow slowly in the dark, while the ministry kept the country asleep, because a sleeping country was a country that would not look for it, and it had counted on the ministry's lie the way a parasite counts on the host's good health. Now the lie had a crack in it, a hairfine line on the wireless, and the thing in the dark felt the country wake a degree, and turned what it had instead of a face toward the south, toward London, toward the famous troublesome Potter who would not stay dead and would not stay quiet, and began, for the first time in 3 years, to make plans of its own. 8 asterisk 8 asterisk 8 asterisk. The ministry's answer came 3 nights later, and it came the way the ministry always answered, with force dressed as law, and it taught Harry something he had suspected and needed to confirm, which was exactly how strong he had become. They came to Grimmauld Place. The Fidelius was old and frayed, and Harry had let it fray, because a perfectly hidden house was a house nobody could be lured to attack, and he wanted them to attack. He wanted the country, which was now listening, to see what the ministry did to a man who told it the truth. So the charm thinned where he wanted it thin, and a tip reached the right desk, and at 2 in the morning the Aurors came down upon the house at number 12 in a force of 30, with 4 Dementors floating above them like the punctuation at the end of a threat. Harry felt them coming before the wards woke. He felt the 4 cold things first, the particular leeching chill that ran ahead of a Dementor and pulled the gladness out of the air. He came down the stairs of Grimmauld Place in his shirt-sleeves with the elder wand loose in his hand and the small black stone warm in his pocket, and behind him on the landing stood Neville with his grandfather's wand and a fighting stillness, and Luna, who had drifted down in a dressing gown printed with constellations that did not exist, and who said to the dark beyond the door in a dreaming voice, "They've brought the cold ones. That was unkind of them. The cold ones don't like it here anymore." "No," Harry agreed, "they don't. Stay back from the door, both of you, not because it's dangerous, because of what they're going to see, and I want them to see it clearly." He opened the front door of number 12 and walked out onto the top step, alone in his shirt-sleeves, into a square full of Aurors, and the 30 wands came up and lit, and a voice he knew, amplified, rolled across the square. Dolores Umbridge, who had come in person because she would not have missed it for the world, riding the operation from the safety of the square's far edge in robes the pink of a closing wound. "Harry Potter," her amplified sweetness sang out, "you are under arrest for sedition, for the theft of classified material, for the unlawful broadcast of state secrets, and for the incitement of disorder. Lay down your wand and submit, and I do so hope you won't, because the warrant, you'll be pleased to know, authorizes the kiss in the event of resistance." Above her, the 4 Dementors drifted forward over the heads of the Aurors, their tattered robes trailing, the cold coming off them in a tide that made the nearest Aurors flinch. And I have decided, Umbridge added with the contentment of a woman arriving at the buffet, that telling lies about the ministry on the wireless is the very definition of resistance. Harry stood on the top step and looked at the four Dementors coming toward him over the square, and he did not raise his wand to cast a Patronus, because a Patronus was the old arithmetic, the desperate light you threw up to hold the dark at bay, and he had stopped doing the desperate things on the morning they took Tessa Crowley. He looked at the four cold things, and let them feel what he was, which he had been hiding for 2 years under a quiet, stubborn man who tried hopeless cases, and which he stopped hiding now on a doorstep, in front of 30 Aurors and a listening country. The nearest Dementor reached the foot of the steps, and the cold reached Harry and broke against him and found nothing in him to leech, because the warmth it fed on was joy, and what stood on the step was not happy and not afraid, and was therefore to Dementor simply unfeedable, a hearth gone to cold iron. The thing hung in the air a yard from his face, hooded, uncertain. And Harry looked into the hood where a face should be and was not, and he spoke to it, not a spell, he did not lift the wand. He spoke to it the way Ragnarok had spoken to him, sovereign to subject, in the oldest register there is. You don't belong to her, he said. You never did. You belong to the cold place at the end of things, and the cold place answers to the one who carries all three, and you can feel which one of us that is. So you have a choice which the ministry never told you had, because the ministry's whole trick is telling things they own that they have no choice. Go back to her and serve the building that chains you in a corridor and rents you out by the night. Or go back to the dark and wait, and when I call you, come, and I'll give you the only thing your kind has ever actually wanted, which is to be feared by the guilty and forgotten by everyone else instead of pimped to frighten healers. Choose, I won't make you, I'm not the ministry. The Dementor at the foot of the steps hung in the cold air for the length of 3 heartbeats, then it sank. It folded down upon itself, the tattered robe collapsing inward, and it turned slowly in the air, and the other 3 turned with it, all 4 hooded faces swinging away from the figure on the step and toward the witch in pink at the edge of the square. And for one long moment the 4 Dementors the ministry had brought to kiss the soul out of Harry Potter hung over Dolores Umbridge's head instead, and the cold that had been rolling toward the house rolled back toward her and she stopped smiling. Then they were gone. Not driven off, dismissed. They rose straight up into the London dark and went north, all 4 together, back toward the cold sea and the fortress on its rock, because their keeper had been overruled by their owner. The square was very quiet. 30 Aurors stood with their lit wands raised and discovered all at once that they had been sent to arrest a man who could send their Dementors home with a word, and that the warrant in Umbridge's hand was a piece of paper and the thing on the doorstep was not. Harry came down 1 step. The Aurors nearest the front gave ground without deciding to, a ripple of half paces backward that ran through the whole formation. He found among the front rank the face he was looking for, his old yearmate, the one who had refused to meet his eyes in Courtroom 10, and he spoke to him and to all of them in the flat, clear voice that the square carried perfectly because the night was so still. You weren't lied to about me, Harry said. I'm exactly as dangerous as she just found out. I want you to understand that because the next part matters. I'm not going to hurt you, any of you. You're not my enemy, you're employees of my enemy, which is a different thing, and most of you took this job for the reason your great-grandfathers did, because you wanted to keep people safe, and the ministry was the only shop that hired for it. I know. I took the same job for the same reason, and they put me to cataloging cauldrons when I tried to do it. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to lower your wands and go home and tell whoever debriefs you the truth, which is that you were ordered to kiss a man for telling the country its government lied to it, and that he dismissed the Dementors and let you walk. And then in a week or a month, when you've had time to think about which side of this you want your children to know you were on, some of you are going to come find me. I'll be easy to find. I'm done hiding. He looked at Umbridge at the far edge of the square, alone now, her pink Gonzalo in the wanlight. Take her home. She'll need someone to explain to the minister why his terror went north without permission. Tell him I said the cold ones know who their landlord is now. Tell him the rent's coming due. The Aurors went, not all at once and not in good order, but they went, lowering their wands 1 rank at a time, backing out of the square into the side streets and the disapparition points, taking Umbridge with them like men carrying a thing they had stopped wanting to touch. Harry stood on the steps until the last of them was gone and the cold had drained out of the square and the ordinary London night came back, the distant traffic, the orange of the street lamps, a fox somewhere going through the bins. Behind him in the doorway, Neville let out a breath that he had been holding for a while. Harry, he said very quietly in the voice of a man who had stood at the worst battles of the last war. What was that? What did you just do? I showed them the new arithmetic, Harry said. He was looking north, the way the Dementors had gone, toward a cold sea and a fortress and a healer in a windowless cell who had told him he tried it the right way. And I told the country a true story they can check, on a night the ministry couldn't edit, and the ministry answered by trying to eat my soul on my own doorstep, and failed in front of 30 witnesses who'll all go home and tell it differently than the prophet will print it. He turned and went back into the house past Luna, who reached out and touched his sleeve as he passed with the absent tenderness of someone comforting a person who did not yet know he would need comforting. That's the second crack, Neville. The money was the first. The story was the second. There's one more and it's the foundation, and when I pull that one the building doesn't crack. It comes down, but not tonight. Tonight I'm going to write to Tessa Crowley and tell her to hold on because for the first time it's true. Far to the north, on a black rock in a colder sea, the Dementors of Azkaban settled back over their prison. and the prisoners in the lightless cells felt, for no reason they could name, the cold eased by a single degree, as though somewhere very far away a hand had been laid on the thing that tormented them, and had told it not yet but soon. In her cell, Tessa Crowley lifted her head off the stone for the first time in 9 days, and listened to a silence that had changed, and did not understand why, and chose, against all the evidence of her situation, to hope. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. The machinery Azkaban stood on a rock in the North Sea that no chart admitted to, a triangular fortress raised by a wizard called Acrisdes who had been mad in the specific way that builds prisons, and for 500 years the Ministry had kept its enemies there under the guard of the Dementors and called the arrangement security. Harry came to it at the turn of the tide, alone, walking across the water. He had not planned to walk across the water. He had planned to take a boat, because that was how one approached Azkaban, in a windowless ministry boat rowed by a charm that did not require a soul to crew it. But the Dementors had come out to meet him before he reached the boat, all of them, the whole garrison rising off the fortress like smoke off a fire reversed, 200 tattered shapes pouring south across the black water toward the one man foolish enough to come. The sea between him and the rock had gone to ice in their wake, a road of it, gray and grinding, laid down by the cold that rode before them. So he walked across the water because they had made him a road, and a man who is offered a road by his enemies and refuses it out of pride deserves the swim. They did not attack. That was the thing the Ministry would never afterward be able to explain, the thing the surviving guards would describe in voices that shook, that the Dementors of Azkaban had flown out to meet Harry Potter in their full and terrible number, and had then arranged themselves above him and around him as he crossed, an honor guard of horrors. The cold poured off them and broke against him and found nothing to take. He walked the ice road under 200 hooded faces, and the gladness did not leave him because he carried none to lose. He carried instead the cold clarity that had replaced it, and the cold clarity was a thing the cold ones recognized as kin. By the time he reached the foot of the fortress wall, the Dementors had settled onto the rocks around the prison in their ranks, hoods bowed, waiting in the way a pack waits for the one whose scent has changed to give the word. He gave it. He stood on the wet black rock at the base of Acrisdes' mad triangle and spoke to 200 Dementors in the oldest register there is, sovereign to subject, and what he said was, "You're done here, the lease is up. The man who rented you out to frighten children doesn't own you and never did, and I'm closing his account. You can feel what I am, you know I can make you go where I send you. So I'm going to send you somewhere, and I want you to understand it isn't punishment because you've been punished enough, chained to a rock and made to eat misery on a schedule. Go to the cold place at the edge of things and wait. When the guilty need fearing, I'll call and you'll come and you'll do the one true work your kind was ever for, which is to be the dread that sits behind a just law instead of an unjust one. Until then, go. Britain is warm again. Tell the dark I said so." And 200 Dementors rose off the rocks of Azkaban and went. Not north, not south, they went up and then they were not there, in the way breath is not there once the cold stops showing it, and the temperature on the rock climbed 10 degrees in the space of a held breath. The gray ice road across the sea cracked and groaned and began, in the new warmth, to break apart and sink. For the first time in 500 years, the fortress of Azkaban stood unguarded by anything but stone and locks, and the stone and locks were a problem Harry had brought tools for. He stood for a moment with his hand against the streaming black wall and let himself feel the size of what he had just done, because a man who did large things without feeling their size was a man who would soon do a large thing he could not undo. 200 Dementors. The Ministry's oldest terror, the thing that had governed the behavior of an entire people for 5 centuries by sitting at the end of every threat the law could make, gone in a sentence, sent home by a wizard who had asked them rather than driven them, which no one had ever thought to do because no one had ever owned them to ask. He took the feeling and weighed it and set it down. Then he went in to do the harder thing, which was not the power. The power was easy. The judgment was hard. Inside, the prisoners had felt the cold go. They did not know what it meant. A man who has lived 4 years inside a Dementor's range loses the habit of meaning. The cold takes meaning first before it takes the rest, because meaning is the most expensive thing the mind makes and the first it stops affording. So when the cold lifted, what they felt was not hope, which is a meaning, but the absence of a weight they had stopped being able to name. Up and down the lightless tiers, men and women lifted their heads off the stone and discovered they could remember the faces of people they loved. And some of them wept, and some of them, the ones who had been there longest, simply sat in the strange warmth and shook, relearning the shape of a mind that was theirs again. Harry walked the tiers with light at his wand tip, the first light most of these cells had seen in years, and he opened the doors. Not all of them. That was the part he had argued with Hermione about for 2 nights before he came, the part that mattered, the part that separated what he was doing from a simple jailbreak. Because Azkaban held the innocent, yes, the dissidents and the inconvenient, and the healers sentenced for letting a truth escape. It also held the guilty. It held men who had earned their cells, who had done the things the Dementors were a punishment for, murderers and worse. And a revolution that flung every cell wide in the name of justice was a revolution that loosed murderers in the name of justice and called it liberation and was lying. So he had brought the access ledgers copied by a defecting records clerk, and he had read every case, all 406 of them, and he had marked each one. It had taken him a week of nights. He had not enjoyed it. There is no clean way to sit at a table and decide name by name which strangers go free and which stay in a cell, and he had not let himself pretend otherwise, because the men who built Courtroom 10 had also believed at the start that they were only being responsible. He walked the tiers and opened the doors of the wrongly held and left shut the doors of the rightly held, and at each shut door he stopped and looked in and told the prisoner the truth, which was more than the ministry had ever done. "You stay," he said at the door of a man who had killed 3 people for a vault key and laughed in the dock. "Not because the ministry says so, the ministry's word is worth nothing now. You stay because the warmth I just brought to this rock doesn't change what you did to the Abbott family, and a country where that walks free on its first warm night isn't a country I'll build. When there's a court worth the name, you'll have a trial worth the name, which is more than you gave them. Until then the warmth stays and the door stays shut. That's the difference between me and the thing I'm tearing down. It's the only difference that matters, and I'm not going to spend it on my first night to make the story cleaner." The prisoner at the door spat at him and called him a hypocrite, and asked what gave one wizard the right to sit in judgment over who was free, and it was, Harry thought, walking on, an excellent question, the best one he had been asked all night, and he did not have a clean answer to it, and the not having was important, and he kept it. A man who had a clean answer to that question was a man who had stopped feeling its weight, and a man who had stopped feeling its weight was a Selwyn in waiting. Tessa Crowley's cell was on the 3rd tier, and she was sitting against the wall with her competent hands open in her lap when his light reached her, and she looked at him for a long moment in the new warmth, and what she said was not "thank you." What she said was, "How many did you leave shut?" 41, Harry said, "out of 406. I read every file. I'll show you the markings. You should check my work, you and Hermione both, because I'm exactly the kind of man who shouldn't be trusted to decide who stays in a cell, and I know it, and that's why I want you checking." He crouched in the open doorway so they were level. "I told you I'd get you out. I told you quietly, and you were right not to believe me because a man couldn't have. But I stopped being only a man somewhere in the last 2 years, and I'm sorry about that, and I'm using it for this. Come on. There are people on the rock who can heal the ones the cold hurt worst, and you're the best healer in Britain, and Britain's about to need you. The 4th floor at St. Mungo's is going to look small compared to what's coming." She got to her feet slowly, holding the wall, and looked down the tier at the open doors and the shut ones, and did the thing he had hoped she would do, which was to walk to one of the shut doors and read the file by his wan light and nod once grimly, agreeing with the cell. Then she turned back with the particular steadiness of a person who has been to the bottom of a thing and come back up with her judgment intact. "All right," Tessa said, "but I check all 41 tonight. Before you take credit for any of it, because if you've left one person in a cell who doesn't belong there, Harry Potter, you're not the difference. You're just the next version of it that smiles more." "That's the deal," Harry said. "That's exactly the deal." And he found, crouched in the doorway of a cell in the worst place in Britain, that he liked her enormously, in the way you like the one honest light in a dark room, the wand that refuses to shine on command. He had not come north only to free her. He had come north to find the person who would tell him no with the most authority, and he had found her. And he was not above admitting that he had wanted the finding for himself as much as for her, because a man building what he was building needed witnesses who could not be flattered, and they were rarer than power and worth more. She checked the 41 that night by candle in the warm guardroom where the prison's former keepers had fled and left their tea things, and she cleared 39 and queried 2, and Harry reopened one of the 2 when she made her case and held the other when she conceded his, and that, he thought, watching her argue a stranger's freedom across a table at 3 in the morning, was the first court of the new country, 2 tired people and a candle and a refusal to be lazy about a life. It had no marble. It had no Wisengamot. It was better than anything that had happened in Courtroom 10 in living memory, and it had happened in a prison, which was either an irony or an instruction, and he chose to take it as an instruction. 8 asterisk 8 asterisk 8 asterisk. The country woke the next morning to find that Azkaban had been emptied of the innocent and its dementors gone, and the ministry's version of this and the truth of it could not be made to fit in the same skull, and so the skulls of Britain began in their millions to choose. The prophet called it a mass escape of dangerous criminals. The trouble with that was the 41. Harry had foreseen the headline and answered it before it printed by the simple expedient of releasing, through the channels the defecting clerks now gave him, the complete list. Every name freed with the charge each had been held on, and every name kept with the crime each was guilty of, and the markings in Harry's own hand and Tessa Crowley's countersignature on each one. You could call it a jailbreak. You could not call it a jailbreak that left the murderers in their cells and freed the healers, because no jailbreak in the history of jailbreaks had ever done that, and the people of Britain, who were not stupid, only frightened and badly informed, looked at the list and understood that they were being told 2 stories again, and that one of them had arithmetic in it and the other had only adjectives. Defections, which had been a trickle, became a current. They came to the safe houses now in tens. Orers, whole patrols of them, who had taken the job to keep people safe, and had finally been given a place to do it that was not the building. Clerks who brought their department's secrets rolled in newspapers. A Wisengamot member, the Ravenclaw witch from Courtroom 10, Griselda Marchbanks, 90-something and afraid of nobody, who arrived at Grimmauld Place under her own power with her examiner's robe still on, and said to Harry without preamble, "I voted dark in that courtroom and it changed nothing, which I have decided I cannot live with. I examined you for your defense OWL when you were 15. You were the best I ever passed. I should have known then you would be trouble. Where do you want me? Harry put her on the law with Hermione because a revolution that the oldest living examiner of magical Britain has publicly joined is a revolution that has stopped being a crime and started being a government, and everyone on both sides knew it. Hermione had started in the meantime to do the thing Hermione did, which was to turn a grievance with good production values into a document. She had filled the drawing room with parchment. She had the defectors organized into committees before most of them had unpacked, and the committees had remits, and the remits had been written down, and somewhere in the chaos of it a thing was being born that had a shape, the shape of an answer to the question she had asked in the anteroom, and Harry watched her build it and understood that this, not the Dementors, not the wards, was the part that would decide whether any of it was worth doing. Power he could supply. A country was a thing only Hermione could draft. You freed 400 people and kept 41, she said to him on the second night, not looking up from a clause, and you let a healer countersign the 41 and you released the whole ledger to the press before they could lie about it. Do you understand that that one decision did more to make you a government than the entire Department of Mysteries will? Anyone can take a prison. You ran it like a court for one night and then told the truth about how you ran it. That's the whole thing, Harry. That's the only thing. If you keep doing that, I'll follow you into the fire. The day you stop, I draft the charges myself. She did look up then. I'm putting that in writing too, the right to draft the charges against you in the founding document. I want it on the first page. Put it on the first page, Harry said. Make it the first line. A country whose first written law is that the founder can be tried is a country worth founding. Everything else is commentary. 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk. The cost came on a Thursday in the kitchen at the Burrow, where Harry went because Molly Weasley had written him a letter that said, "Only come and let me feed you, you idiot boy," and he had gone because there were debts you paid even when the paying was a knife. Arthur Weasley sat at the head of the long scrubbed table where Harry had eaten 100 meals as a child, and he did not look like a man whose office Harry was about to dissolve. He looked tired and kind and 20 years honest in a building that had never once promoted him for it, and that was the whole tragedy of him sitting there, that the ministry's best argument was a good man it had used up. "I can't come over to you, Harry," Arthur said before Harry had got his coat off. He said it gently in the way you tell a child a true hard thing. "I want to. Molly's been at me for a week. But I've spent 23 years in that building trying to make it a little less cruel from the inside, one regulation at a time, one family helped at a time, and if everyone like me walks out the day it gets hard, then the building's left to nobody but the Selwyns, and the next person who needs a kind hand on the Muggle artifacts desk doesn't get one. Somebody has to stay and be the good part. I think it has to be me. I think it has always been my job." He turned his teacup. "I am not going to fight you. I couldn't and I wouldn't. But I'm not going to leave my post either, and you should know that going in, so that when your people come through the ministry's doors, they find me at my desk doing my job and you don't get to be surprised. It would have been easier if he had been a villain." That was the thought Harry sat with at the Burrows table, the thought that did not go away. Every system survives on its Arthur Weasleys, the decent people who hold the rotten thing up out of love for the few it lets them help, who become, without ever choosing villainy, the human shield a tyranny hides behind. You could not hate Arthur. You could only grieve that the building had found his goodness and bent it into a leash, the same trick it had worked on Percy, the same trick it worked on everyone worth corrupting, because the building never wanted bad people. Bad people were unreliable. It wanted good people it could point it the right way. "I know," Harry said. "I know it's your job. I'm not going to ask you to leave it. I'm going to ask you something harder and you can say no, and I'll still eat whatever Molly's about to put in front of me, and we'll talk about plugs." He leaned forward. "When my people come through the doors, be at your desk. I mean it. Be the good part. Because here's what I need, Arthur, and the ministry never needed it, and that's how I know it was rot. I need there to be people inside it on the day it changes hands who the clerks trust, who can stand in a corridor and say, 'It's all right, keep working, nobody's going to hurt you, this one's different.' The Selwyns can't give that order, nobody believes them, you can. You've spent 23 years earning the right to be believed by frightened people, and I'm asking you to spend it not on me, on them. Stay at your desk, be the proof that the change isn't a massacre. That's not coming over to my side. That's staying exactly where you are and being who you've always been on the worst morning. It might be the most useful thing any honest man in that building ever does." Arthur was quiet for a long moment, and his kind, tired eyes moved over Harry's face, reading it. "You've got an answer for everything," he said at last. "That's what frightens me about you, Harry, not the power." Tom had power. "You've got an answer for everything, and the answers are good, and good answers are how good men talk themselves into terrible things, one reasonable step at a time." He sighed, and it was not a refusal. "I'll be at my desk. I was always going to be at my desk. But I'll be at it as Arthur Weasley, not as your man, and if your people frighten my clerks, I'll stand in front of them, and if you become the thing you're tearing down, I'll be the first to tell you in this kitchen, with no answer good enough to stop me." "That's the deal. That's the only deal I'd take," Harry said. He looked down the table at Ron, who had come in halfway through and stood in the doorway with his arms folded, saying nothing, which from Ron was the loudest thing in the room. "Ron, don't," Ron said. "Don't make me pick in my mum's kitchen with my dad sitting right there. That's a rot thing to do, and you know it's rot." "I'm not asking you to pick," Harry said. "I'm telling you I'd rather you didn't. I'd rather you stayed exactly where you are, with your family out of it alive, and let me carry this one, because I've got things to carry it with that you haven't, and there's no shame in not following a friend into fire when the friend's gone fireproof and you haven't." He stood and put his coat back on, the meal half eaten, because some debts you pay by leaving before you make it worse. "But I'll tell you the true thing, Ron, the one you came into here and won't ask for. When it's done, when the building's down and the new thing's standing, there'll be a chair at the table for you. There always will be. I'm not building a country that doesn't have a chair for you in it. That's most of why I'm building it. You can sit in the chair or leave it empty, and either way it's yours, and I'll fight anyone who tries to take it, including you." Ron didn't answer. But when Harry passed him in the doorway, Ron's hand came out and gripped his shoulder, once hard, the grip of a man who cannot say the thing and needs you to know it anyway, and then let go. And that was Ron, and it was enough, and it had to be, because the alternative to it being enough was unbearable. And Harry had learned to live inside the bearable parts of unbearable things. He bent and kissed Molly Weasley's cheek where she stood by the stove with her hand pressed to her mouth, and he went out into the Devon dark, and behind him the Burrow's warm window stayed lit a long time, with the people he loved inside it on the other side of a line he had drawn through their kitchen. That was the cost. He paid it and did not pretend it was anything but a wound, and walked north up the dark lane carrying it, because carrying things you could not fix was, he had come to understand, the actual job, and the power was only the part that made it possible to keep walking. 8 asterisk 8 asterisk 8 asterisk. The Death Eaters came to him on the road back from the Burrow, which told him something useful, that they were watching him, and that they thought him weak enough that night. There were 2 of them, and they came openly, wands holstered, hands visible, in the manner of an embassy rather than an ambush. He knew one, Corbin Yaxley, heavier now, the old cruelty gone to fat around the eyes but still there in the eyes themselves. The other Harry did not know, a younger man with the bloodless look of someone who had spent recent years in the company of a thing that was not quite alive. "Potter," Yaxley said, with a courtesy that cost him visibly. "A word from a mutual friend. He has watched what you are doing with great interest. The bank, the wireless, the prison, he says, and these are his words, that he has spent his life trying to do what you have done in a single season, and that he is prepared to be generous about the resentment that ordinarily causes him." Yaxley spread his empty hands. "He proposes an arrangement. You have the love of the rabble and the favor of the goblins and a talent for tearing down. He has the old families, the foreign friends, the deep arts, and a talent for what comes after tearing down, which, forgive me, you have not yet demonstrated. Together you finish the ministry in a month instead of a year. Afterward you divide it. He is not greedy. He says he would be content with the things you do not want, the dark arts, the pure blood, the right to rule the magical, and let you play emperor over the mud. His words again, not mine. I am only the post." Harry stood in the road in the Devon dark and looked at the embassy of the thing that had murdered his parents, and he understood, with the cold clarity that had replaced his patience, exactly how dangerous the offer was, which was very, because it was true. He could not do the after alone. Voldemort could not do the tearing down alone, not anymore, not with his name still poison. He needed Harry's love of the rabble in the way Harry needed someone's gold and someone's records. They were, in the brute arithmetic of it, complementary, and a lesser man, a man who cared only about winning, would have taken the deal and meant to betray it later and would have lost, because you did not betray Voldemort. Betrayal was the only art he had ever truly mastered. "Tell him no," Harry said, "and tell him why, because the why is the whole thing and he should hear it. He thinks tearing down and building up are 2 talents and that he has the second and I have the first. He's wrong. They're the same talent pointed 2 ways, and the thing that decides which way it points is the only question that's ever mattered about either of us, which is what you'd put in the hole once it's empty. He'd put himself in the hole. He always has. Every empire he's ever dreamed has had exactly one person standing up in it and everyone else kneeling, which isn't an empire, it's a very large mirror. I'm building a thing with the goblins standing up in it, and the elves, and the lift man, and the healer, and a chair at a table for a friend who's furious with me. He can't even imagine that. It would look to him like losing. So tell him no, and tell him I said the difference between us isn't power. He was always going to lose the power contest the day I picked up all 3 of the old things and he picked up none. The difference is that I know what the throne is for, and he only knows that he wants to sit in it." He took 1 step toward Yaxley, and Yaxley, who had once made grown Aurors flinch, gave ground without deciding to. "Now go home," Harry said, "while there's a home and a you to go to it. The next time I see either of you it won't be as the post, and tell him one more thing, since you'll tell him everything anyway. Tell him I left 41 people in Azkaban last night because they earned their cells, and that he should think very carefully about which of those 2 lists he'd be on in the country I'm building, the freed or the kept, before he sends me another offer to share it." Yaxley's fat-lidded eyes moved over him, recalculating, and whatever he had been sent expecting, it was not a refusal that came with a true reason attached, because true reasons were not currency in the place he had come from. He bowed fractionally, the bow of a man backing away from a thing he has decided not to provoke tonight, and the 2 of them turned and walked into the dark and were gone. Somewhere in a place the Department of Mysteries would not name, the thing that had sent them received the answer and did not rage, which would have been the old Voldemort, but went very still, and began to plan in earnest, because Potter had told him the truth about himself, and there is nothing a creature like that hates so much as being seen. 8 asterisk 8 asterisk 8 asterisk. The foundation was the last thing and the deepest, and Harry left it for last on purpose, because you did not take the root of a country casually, and because by the time he took it he wanted the country already half decided in his favor, so that the taking looked like an answer and not a coup. The Department of Mysteries did not have a door so much as a willingness. You reached the 9th level and walked into the round black room with its many doors that spun when you entered, so that you could never map it. And the room decided whether to let you deeper, and it decided based on what you wanted, because the whole department was built around the principle that the deep things of magic could only be approached by people who wanted the right things, and that wanting the wrong things would, helpfully, get you lost forever in a spinning room. The Unspeakables had served the department for centuries. They were not Selwyn's men. That was the thing Harry had understood that the ministry never had. The Unspeakables did not serve the minister, they served the mysteries, and they had let the minister believe otherwise because the belief was useful and the truth was none of his business. Harry walked into the spinning room with Hermione at his left and Luna at his right, and the doors blurred around them and stopped, and Luna said in her dreaming voice to the room rather than to anyone in it, "He wants to give the deep things back the dignity the building took from them. That is true, you can check." And the room which could check checked and opened the one door that mattered. It let them down to the chamber of the confluence, the deep knot under the ministry where the lays of Britain crossed, the cold root of the country that Harry had stood beside 2 weeks before and not touched. There were 3 Unspeakables waiting there, hooded in the gray that meant they had given up their names to the work, and the eldest of them, a woman by her voice, stepped forward and pushed back her hood, and she was old, older than Marchbanks, with eyes that had looked at the deep things so long they had taken some of the color. "We have watched you come down the levels for 2 years, Harry Potter," she said. "We let you. We let you read what the minister classified, because the minister classified the things to hide them from the public, and we kept them to understand them. And a man who came down to understand was a man on our side of a line the minister never knew was drawn. We have been waiting to see what you would do when you reached the bottom. The last man who reached the bottom and put his hand on the root used it to make himself a minister, and then sold the country's wards to the comfort of the few. You have all 3 of the old things in your pockets. You could put your hand on the root and make yourself a god. We could not stop you. We are asking before you touch it the only question we are permitted to ask, which is the question the room asks, which is the question your friend already answered for you, and we would like to hear it in your own voice. What do you want it for?" And Harry Potter stood at the cold root of Britain with the cloak in his coat and the stone in his pocket and the elder wand in his hand. The assembled hallows of death gathered on one living man for the first time in 600 years, and he gave the unspeakable the true answer, because the room would have known a false one, and so would he. "I want to bind it to the law instead of the man," he said. "Right now the wards of Britain answer to whoever holds this building, which means they answer to a person, which means the person is above the wards, which means the person is above the law because the wards are the law's last enforcement. That's the inversion. That's the rot all the way down, the same rot as Courtroom 10, the same rot as the cell I left shut last night, the top bound least and the bottom bound most. I want to turn it over. I want to lay the wards so they answer not to whoever holds the building but to whoever keeps the compact, and to bind the compact so that the more power a man draws from it the more of himself he's pledged against it, so that the throne grips the king harder than the king grips the throne. I want to make a country where the most powerful wizard alive is the least free man in it, because his power is alone against his life on goblin terms that he can never quietly forgive himself. I'll be that wizard. I'm volunteering to be the least free man in Britain. That's what I want it for. Check." The old Unspeakable looked at him for a long time with her color-leached eyes, and the room checked, and the root of the country hummed in the dark, and Hermione beside him had gone very still in the particular way of a person watching the thing she had argued for actually arrive, and Luna had her face turned up toward a ceiling she could not see, smiling at it. "It is true," the Unspeakable said at last, and there was something in her ancient voice that had not been there before, something that in a younger woman you would have had to call wonder. "He wants the chains for himself first. In 400 years no one has ever wanted the chains for himself first. They come down to be freed or to be made gods, and the room sends them back up lost, and we go back to our work. You came down to be bound." She stepped aside from the root, and the other 2 stepped aside with her, and she said, "Then we will not stop you, Master of Death. We will do the older thing. We will help you. The mysteries have waited a long time for a wizard who came to the bottom to bind himself instead of to be freed. Put your hand on the root. We will show you where the law goes." Harry Potter put his hand on the cold root of Britain, and it was not like touching stone. It was like taking hold of a current that had been running under his whole life without his consent, the deep flow of every ward and every charm and every oath that held the magical island together. And for one moment it was too much, the whole weight of a country's enchantment pouring up his arm, and the elder wand in his other hand flared white and answered it. The master of the wand meeting the root the wand had been cut to serve. The Unspeakables moved around him in the dark, their hands tracing the old paths, showing him where the law went, how to lay a binding into the lays so that it would hold 1,000 years, how to write into the foundation itself the clause Hermione had wanted on the first page. The founder can be tried so that it lived not on parchment which burns but in the bones of the country which do not. The wards of Britain turned slowly in the deep dark toward a new keeping. Far above them the building shuddered down to its own bones as the foundation it sat on stopped being its own. In the minister's office, 300 feet up, Cassius Selwyn felt the floor move beneath his expensive boots and did not know why, and reached for the bell that summoned the wards to his command, the bell every minister for 500 years had been able to ring, and rang it, and nothing came. The wards had a new landlord now, and the rent was finally, after 900 years, coming due, and Selwyn sat alone in his grand dark office at the top of a building that had quietly ceased to belong to him, ringing a bell that no longer rang, while 300 feet below a tired wizard with a cut on his hand wrote a country into the stone. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. The fall of the ministry. He named the day, and the day was a Wednesday because the ministry had taught him what it thought of Tuesdays, and he had decided the new country would keep better hours. It began at the opening of the markets. Gringotts did not announce the calling of the crown's loans, goblins did not announce, they acted, and the announcement was the action. At 9 o'clock the bank simply declined to honor the ministry's line of credit, and an hour later it began, politely and with perfect documentation, to call the principal, and by noon the news had moved through the financial veins of magical Britain the way a clot moves through a body that does not yet know it is dying. The ministry could not pay its oarers. The ministry could not pay its clerks. The vaults that backed the galleon had been, it turned out, backed in turn by goblin forbearance, and the forbearance had ended. And a currency is only a story about debt that everyone agrees to keep believing, and the goblins had stopped agreeing in writing. It was Gornok who carried the calling to the ministry's own counting house, walking in through the front with a ledger and 2 clerks and the unhurried contempt of a creditor who has waited 900 years and can therefore wait an hour more, and the wizards behind the counter who had spent their careers treating goblins as a kind of intelligent furniture, discovered in the space of a morning that the furniture held the deeds. There was no shouting. Goblins did not shout, and the ministry's bankers had nothing to shout with. No gold to throw at the problem because the gold had always been a courtesy and the courtesy was withdrawn. By the time the sun was over the Thames, the most powerful government in magical Europe could not have bought a round of drinks on its own credit, and every wizard who kept his savings in a vault understood, in the cold place under the stomach where money lives, that the old arrangement was over. At the same hour, the Wizarding Wireless Network, which was now a free channel because the ministry had been forced to choose between letting Harry speak and destroying its own monopoly, and had, in its cleverness, chosen to destroy the monopoly, carried the second blow. Hermione had spent the week assembling it. Not a speech again, but a release, the complete accounting of Selwyn's government, the nominee structures, the buried debts, the names on the reclassification orders, the schedule of every trial moved to Tuesday for a decade, read out by rotating cast of the defectors so that no single voice could be called mad. It went out for 6 hours. It was very boring, that was the point. You could call a man a liar exciting. You could not call 6 hours of cross-reference financial documentation a breakdown. And the country, listening in its kitchens, understood that the boring thing was the true thing, because the truth is almost always boring and the lie is almost always thrilling, and a people learns to tell them apart eventually if you give it 6 uninterrupted hours. And under both of these, unannounced, unfelt by anyone but the wizard who had laid it and the 3 hooded keepers who had shown him where the law went, the wards of Britain had already turned. That was the blow no one could see, the one that made the other 2 survivable. When the ministry's orders went unpaid and its currency wobbled and its lie lay disassembled on the wireless, the building that should have been able to declare an emergency, to seal the flu, to lock down the country and ride out the panic by force, reached for its oldest power and found the power did not answer. Selwyn rang the bell that summoned the wards and nothing came. The Ministry of Magic, on the Wednesday Harry named, was a government that could not pay, could not lie, and could not command its own foundations, and a government that can do none of those 3 things is not a government anymore. It is a building full of frightened people waiting to be told what happens next. Harry went to tell them. 8-spoked asterisk, 8-spoked asterisk, 8-spoked asterisk. He walked into the ministry through the front door, through the muggle entrance and the red telephone box and the long descent, because he had taken the building's foundation precisely so that he would never have to take the building by force, and a man who has made force unnecessary should have the discipline not to use it for the theater. He came in plain dark robes with the elder wand in its wrist holster and the cloak folded weightless in his coat and the stone in his pocket, and he came with 20 people, not an army, an embassy. Hermione with the founding document, Marchbanks in her examiner's robes lending the whole thing the legitimacy of 90 years, Neville unarmed and enormous and calm, Tessa Crowley in healer's white because Harry wanted the first face the ministry's clerks saw to be a face the ministry had tried to destroy, and Ragnarok's envoy Gornok, who had finished with the counting house and come to watch the rest. The atrium received them. Harry had wondered, walking down, what state he would find it in, and the answer was the worst possible state for tyranny and the best possible for him, which was ordinary. The lifts ran. The clerks moved between the fireplaces with their memos. The Fountain of Magical Brethren, the monument they called the Triumph of Order, with its 40-foot wizard and its kneeling goblin and bowing centaur and reaching elf and folded-handed healer, still poured its water into its black marble basin. The machinery of the building was doing its job because the people who ran it had not been told to stop. And that was the thing Harry had counted on, that a building is mostly Arthur Weasley's, and Arthur Weasley's come to work. And there in the middle of the atrium, between the Embassy of the New Order and the lift that led up to the minister's office, stood Arthur Weasley at a small folding table he had set up himself, with a kettle and a stack of parchment and a hand-lettered sign that said in his careful ministry print information, "Keep calm, work continues." He had not told Harry he would do this. He had told Harry he would be at his desk. He had decided in the days since that being at his desk was not enough, that the moment needed a thing the powerful never thought to provide, which was a kind person at a small table telling frightened clerks that it was all right to keep working. And he had appointed himself to it because that was who he was, and Harry, crossing the marble toward him, understood that Arthur Weasley had just done more to make the transition bloodless than all 20 members of the embassy combined. "The lifts are still running," Arthur said by way of greeting, looking up from pouring tea for a records witch whose hands would not be still. "Department of Transportation never got the order to stop them on account of there's no one upstairs giving orders anyone believes. I've told everyone to keep at their work. A government's just people doing useful things for each other. If the people keep doing the useful things, there's no gap for anyone to get hurt in. That's not a side I've taken, Harry. That's just the job. The job doesn't change because the name on the door does. You remember that when it's your name." "I'll remember it," Harry said. "I came down here to make sure it's never just my name, but I'll remember it." He put his hand on Arthur's shoulder once and meant a great deal by it that there was no time to say, and Arthur, who had known him since he was 12, heard all of it anyway. "Keep the table, keep the tea. When this is over, I'm going to want you to run the part of the new thing that does exactly this. The part that keeps the lifts running and the frightened people calm. Because it turns out that's the most important department there is, and the old ministry never even gave it a name." A clerk near the fireplaces, a young one, had stopped with his memos clutched to his chest and was watching the embassy cross the marble with the particular stillness of a man deciding whether to run. And Tessa Crowley, who knew that stillness from 9 years of spell-damaged wards, stepped out of the line and went to him in her white and said something quiet and put a hand on his arm, and the clerk looked at the face of the healer the wireless had said was sentenced to Azkaban. Standing alive and free in the atrium telling him to breathe, and he breathed and went back to his memos, and that multiplied by 1,000 frightened clerks was how a government changed hands without a body on the marble. Harry watched it and understood that he had brought the right 20 people and that the most dangerous-looking person in his embassy was the unarmed healer because she was the proof walking that the worst thing the old order swore about him was a lie. Then he went up to take the office, and he took it the way you take a thing that is already yours, which is to say without violence, by walking in. 8-spoked asterisk 8-spoked asterisk 8-spoked asterisk Cassius Selwyn was not a coward. Harry had to grant him that going in. A lesser tyrant would have fled through the flue at dawn or barricaded the office or taken hostages. Selwyn sat behind the great desk at the top of the ministry in his expensive robes with the dead bell in front of him, and he had poured 2 glasses of a very old fire whiskey, and he gestured Harry to the chair across the desk with the weary courtesy of a man who has done the arithmetic and arrived at the same total everyone else has. "Sit," Selwyn said. "You've won. I'd rather we discussed it like adults than have your goblin read me my debts. Sit and have a drink and tell me one thing because I've earned one true answer and you're the sort who'll give it. How long have you owned the wards? Be precise. I'm a connoisseur of my own defeat. I'd like to know the exact hour I stopped being the minister and started being a man in a chair who hadn't noticed yet." Harry sat. He did not touch the whiskey. 16 days, he said. "You stopped being the minister 16 days ago in the chamber under the chamber while you were ringing the bell and nothing came. Everything since has been you continuing out of habit, the way a chicken runs after the axe. I'm not telling you that to be cruel, you asked for precise." Selwyn took this in and turned his glass, and something moved over his long, pale face that was almost amusement, the appreciation one professional has for another's clean work. 16 days, I gave a speech on the 8th. About continuity of government, he drank. "The thing you won't understand, Potter, the thing your kind never understands until you've sat in this chair for a while is that I'm not the disease, I'm the symptom. You can take the wards and call the loans and free the wireless, you can put your healer in the atrium and your goblin in my anteroom, and in 10 years you'll be sitting in this chair or one like it, and you'll have a Selwyn of your own because the chair makes him. The chair is the problem, and you've just won the chair. I almost feel sorry for you. You fought your way to the top of the exact thing that ruined me, and you think the view's going to be different." "You're right," Harry said. "That's the most honest thing anyone in this building has ever said to me, and you're right, and I want you to know I heard it, because it's the thing I'm most afraid of, and you just named it cleanly." He leaned forward. "But you're wrong about one piece, the load-bearing piece, and the wrongness is the whole reason I did it the way I did instead of the way you'd have done it. You think the chair makes the man. It doesn't. The bindings make the man. You sat in a chair that bound the bottom and freed the top, and it made you a Selwyn exactly as you say. I've spent 16 days relaying the wards so the chair binds the top hardest. So the man who sits in it has pledged more of his own life than anyone he governs, so that the moment he decides he's the exception, the binding he laid on himself comes for him first. I didn't win your chair, Selwyn. I burned it, and I'm building a different one, and the difference is in the joinery where nobody looks, which is exactly why it'll hold and your marble didn't." He stood. "You're not going to ask. There's no Azkaban anymore. I emptied it. You're going to stand trial, a real one, on a day that isn't a Tuesday in front of a court that isn't bought, with a defense you choose and evidence you can challenge, which is more than you gave Tessa Crowley, and the fact that it's more than you gave her is the only revenge I'm going to take, and it's a better one than killing you. Gornuk has your debts. Hermione has your charges. Walk down on your own feet. Keep that much." And Cassius Selwyn, who was not a coward, finished his whiskey and stood and walked down through his own atrium on his own feet, past the clerks who had served him and the goblin who had ruined him and the healer he had tried to destroy, and out of the government he had owned, and the office at the top of the ministry stood empty for the first time in 900 years, waiting for someone to decide what it was for. Dolores Umbridge did not walk down on her own feet. She had to be found, which took an hour because she had locked herself in her pink office on the first floor and was burning files. And when Neville and two defected Aurors opened the door, she had her wand out and a curse half formed. And Neville, who did not blink in arguments and did not blink here, took the curse on a shield that his grandmother had taught him and his parents had died unable to teach him, and disarmed her with a flick and said only, "You sentence my friend's parents to a fate worse than the one you just tried for, and I'm not going to do anything to you except what the law says, and that's the worst thing I can think of to do to you, Dolores, so think about it on the way down." And they walked her down, and she went the gray of old porridge, because for the first time in her career there was a law above her that she had not written and could not flatter. And that, Harry thought watching from the gallery, was justice, the actual thing, which looks nothing like vengeance and is far more frightening to the guilty, because vengeance ends and justice is patient. 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk He founded the country from the atrium. At the foot of the monument they called the Triumph of Order, and he began the founding by tearing the monument down. He did it himself with the Elder Wand, and he did it slowly so that the country, watching through the wireless that carried every word into every kitchen and the prophet that no longer had an owner and so printed for the first time in a decade what it saw, would understand that the tearing was an argument and not a tantrum. He unmade the 40-foot wizard first, the great robed figure with its raised wand, and let the marble run to sand. Then he turned to the figures gathered at its feet in their attitudes of gratitude, the kneeling goblin and the bowing centaur and the reaching house elf and the witch in healer's robes with her hands folded, and he did not unmake them. He lifted them. He raised the kneeling goblin out of its kneel until it stood and set Gornok's hand to the change so that goblin magic finished what wizard magic began, and the goblin in the marble rose to its feet with a sword in its hand, forged, carried, legal. He raised the bowing centaur until it stood with its head up. He raised the reaching elf until it stood with its hand open, not reaching upward for a master's notice but held out level, the gesture of one who offers rather than begs. And the witch with the folded hands he changed last, and he gave her Tessa Crowley's face, because the sculptor of the old monument had meant her to represent the gratitude of the healed, and Harry meant her to represent something the old order had no word for, which was a person who had been wronged by the law and had lived to help right a better one. Gornok looked up at the goblin standing in the marble with its sword and was silent for a long moment, and then said in the trade tongue low so that only Harry heard it, 900 years we have been carved kneeling at the bottom of your fountains. My grandfather's grandfather watched them raise the first one. I will send word to Ragnarok that the wizard kept the clause about the marble too, which was not even in the treaty. And he put his hand flat against the new stone, and somewhere far below in the deep bank a great many goblins who would never see the atrium felt, through the old craft that bound a nation to the things its hands had made, that something had been set right that they had stopped expecting to live to see. This is the first law, Harry said to the country standing under the changed monument with the marble dust still settling on his shoulders. It isn't a long one. The old ones were long because length is where you hide the parts you don't want read. This one is one sentence and it goes in the stone, not the books, so that no one can quietly amend it on a Tuesday. The law binds the powerful first. Whoever holds the most power in this country holds the most of the law's weight, pledges the most of his own life against his keeping of the trust, and answers first and hardest when the trust is broken. I hold the most power in this country as of this morning. So I am, as of this morning, the most bound person in it, the least free, the first liable. I have already pledged my life on goblin terms and goblin law against the keeping of this. You can check it. The goblins will confirm it. If I break faith with you, my life is forfeit with no appeal and no ransom, and I wrote that clause myself before I had the power so that I could not unwrite it after. He paused, and the atrium was silent, and the country in its kitchens was silent. Every tyranny in history has told you the powerful are above the law because they are powerful. I'm telling you the opposite, and I'm proving it with my own life as the first surety, and the proof is the only thing that makes me different from the man who walked out of this building an hour ago, and I know it, and I want you to hold me to it. That's the country, that's the whole of it. Everything else we'll argue about in courts on days that aren't Tuesdays, but that one goes in the stone. It was not a coronation. He had been careful about that, had argued it with himself for 16 days, because the thing about founding an empire is that the people want to crown you and the wanting is the trap. The wanting is exactly how the chair makes the Selwyn. So he did not let them crown him. But the country, watching the goblin rise to its feet in the marble and the healer take the face of a woman they had heard sentenced on the wireless, knew that something had been founded and that the man standing in the marble dust had founded it, and that whatever you called the thing he now was, minister was too small a word for it. And so they reached in their kitchens and their shops for a larger word, and the larger word, once a people reaches for it, cannot be put back. He had not let them crown him. They crowned him anyway in the only way that lasts, which is in the private decision of millions of people at once that this is the one we will follow now, and there is no law against that and no founding document can prevent it, and Harry felt the weight of it settle onto him in the atrium like a second gravity, and understood that Hermione had been right, that the most dangerous moment was not the taking of the power but this one. The moment the country handed him more than he had asked for and dared him to refuse it. The decrees came in the days that followed, and Harry wrote them short because the old order had governed by the length of its paragraphs, and he had decided the new one would govern by the brevity of its promises, which are harder to break because everyone can remember them. He did not issue many. A revolution that issues 100 laws in its first week is a revolution that has confused activity for foundation, and he had spent 2 years learning the difference. He issued 4. The first ratified the Goblin Treaty into the law of the land, so that the sovereignty Ragnarok had bled for in the deep hall was now the public fact of the country and not a secret between 2 men, and Gornuk carried the sealed copy down to the bank himself, and the goblins who did not celebrate closed the markets for 1 hour, which from the goblins was a festival that would be spoken of for 100 years. Second ended the ownership of house elves, and it ended it in the only way Harry trusted, which was not by freeing them all at once into a world that had taught them to fear freedom, but by writing into the wards themselves a thing that had never been written there before, that no binding magic could compel an elf against an elf's own will, and that an elf could hold, refuse, and leave, and that the law would stand behind the refusal with the full weight of the compact. Tilly was in the atrium when it was read. She did not cheer, she stood very straight in the clothes she had chosen herself, a small, fierce, upright figure among the marble, and she said to no one and to everyone Tilly chose to stay before there was a law. Now Tilly stays and it is choosing, and that is a different staying, and Creature beside her inclined his ancient head, and the two of them stood together under the changed monument like the first citizens of a country that had finally decided they were citizens. The third dissolved the statute's machinery of cruelty, the registries and the commissions and the office of wizarding integrity and every instrument the old order had built to sort wizards into the trusted and the watched, and it replaced them with nothing, because Harry had learned that the most radical act available to a government was occasionally to abolish a thing and decline to build its replacement, to leave a space where a boot had been and trust the people to walk in it. The centaurs sent an emissary for the first time in 2 centuries, a gray-flanked archer named Bane's successor who would not come indoors and so received the news in the courtyard above, and listened, and said only that the herd would watch, which from a centaur was nearly an alliance. Word went out to the werewolves in their hard exile, carried by Remus Lupin's old contacts, that the new country would write them as people and not as beasts, and some of them did not believe it because they had been lied to by every government that ever drew breath, and some of them came south to see, and the seeing began slowly to change them from the dispossessed into the enfranchised, which is the most dangerous transformation there is. Because a people with nothing to lose will follow anyone, and a people with something to keep will fight to keep it. The fourth decree was the one nobody had asked for, and the one Harry cared about most. It established the court's real ones on days that were not Tuesdays, with the right of appeal and the right of defense and the rule that no man's testimony outweighed another's because of his blood or his name. And it placed at the head of them Griselda Marchbanks, 90-something and afraid of nobody, who had spent a lifetime examining the young and would now spend her last years examining the powerful, and who said, accepting it, I have failed to convict the right people for 70 years. Give me a court that lets me start, and I will die in the chair, and it will be the first useful death in my family since the conquest. And the courts opened, and the first case on the first knot. Tuesday was the trial of Cassius Selwyn, conducted exactly as Harry had promised, with a defense and evidence and an appeal, and the watching country understood that the new order would do to its enemies the thing the old order had never done to anyone, which was to give them the law instead of the fear, and that this, more than the wards or the dementors or the goblins, was the empire, the actual thing. The part you could not see in a statue and could only see in how a defeated man was treated on the worst morning of his life. 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk. The recoil came that night, and it came, as the worst of it always did, from the people he respected. Kingsley Shacklebolt found him in the empty office at the top of the ministry, where Harry had gone to be alone with the thing he had become, and Kingsley did not sit and did not soften it, because Kingsley had spent his life being the one honest orer in a dishonest building, and the habit did not switch off for friends. I helped you, Kingsley said. Understand that I'm saying this as a man who opened doors for your people and looked the other way at the right hours and would do it again, because Selwyn was a rot and somebody had to cut it out. So hear me as a friend and not an enemy. I watched a country crown a single wizard tonight who commands the dementors and holds the wards and carries the 3 deathly things out of the old story in his coat like a man carrying his keys. I have spent my whole life believing that no one should hold that much, that the entire point of a ministry, for all its rot, was that the power sat in a building and not in a person, so that when the person went bad you could change the person. You've put it all in a person. You've put it in you, and you're the best man I know, and that is precisely the problem, because the next one won't be, and you'll have built the road he walks in on. He held Harry's eyes. I'm not leaving. I'm telling you I'm afraid, and that I'll say so out loud for as long as you let me, and the day you stop letting me is the day you become the thing. That's my service to the new country. I'm going to be the man who says this to your face once a month for the rest of your life. Then you've understood the job better than anyone I've hired, Harry said, and meant it, and the meaning did not make it easier. Say it once a week. I bound the office, Kingsley. I bound it harder than any office in history has ever been bound, into the bones of the country, with my own life as the surety. But you're right that I can't bind the love, and you're right that the binding is only as good as the people willing to enforce it, and you've just volunteered to be one of them out loud, which is the bravest thing anyone's done in this building today, including me. Stay afraid, recruit others who are. An empire that the brave are afraid of is an empire with a chance. It's the ones nobody dares to fear that rot. Kingsley looked at him a moment longer and nodded once, the nod of a man who has not been reassured and has decided that the refusal to reassure him is itself the reassurance, and went out and left Harry alone with the empty chair and the weight did not lift, and Harry did not want it to, because the day it lifted was the day he should worry. He went down very late to the deep chamber to do the part no one would see, which was the part that mattered. 8 asterisk 8 asterisk 8 asterisk. The relaying of the wards was the only thing he did in those days that he would never be able to explain to anyone who had not been there, and the 3 unspeakables who were there had given up their names precisely so that they would never have to try. He had turned the wards 16 days before, taken them from the building and bound them to the compact in a rough first knot, enough to make Selwyn's bell go dead. Now he laid them properly for 1,000 years, and laying them properly meant binding himself into them. And binding himself into them meant standing at the root of the country with all 3 hallows gathered and letting the deep magic read him to the floor of his soul, because a binding is only as true as the thing it is tied to, and he was tying the freedom of a country to the truth of one man, and the magic would not let him lie about the man. It went down through him like cold light. He stood at the confluence with the elder wand in one hand and the other hand on the root, and the stone warm in his pocket and the cloak across his shoulders. And the lays of Britain ran up into him, and the deep magic opened him like a book and read every page, and there were pages he had not wanted read, the cell he had left shut, and the man who had called him a hypocrite and been right, the line he had drawn through the Burrows' kitchen, the part of him that had liked the power on the doorstep, that had wanted the country to crown him even as he refused the crown, the small dark seed in every revolutionary that says only you can be trusted with this, the seed that had grown into every tyrant who ever lived. The magic read all of it. It did not flinch and it did not forgive. It was not a confessor, it was a scale. It weighed the man against the thing the man was asking to be bound to, and Harry stood at the root of the country and let himself be weighed, and the only reason the binding took, the only reason the lays accepted him, was that he had not lied about any of it, not to the goblins and not to the unspeakables and not to himself, and the deep magic could find no gap between what he claimed to be building and what he was, and a binding holds in exactly the places where there is no gap. The wards took. They ran out from the confluence along the old lays, into the wards of every wizarding home and the enchantments of every magical place, into the foundations of Hogwarts and the stones of Diagon Alley and the rock of the emptied Azkaban, and they reformed around a new center, and the new center was not the ministry and not the office and not even Harry himself. It was the compact, the one sentence in the stone, the law that bound the powerful first, and Harry was bound to the compact as its first and most liable servant, the keystone that bore the most load, the least free man in Britain, exactly as he had told the unspeakable he wished to be. The deep magic settled. The country in its sleep in its kitchens felt nothing, which was correct, because a good foundation is one you never feel and only a bad one announces itself. The eldest unspeakable pushed back her hood when it was done and looked at him with her color-leached eyes, and she said, "It is laid, 1,000 years if the compact holds, less if it breaks, because what you have built is honest, and honest things fail all at once when they fail, where dishonest things rot slowly and stand for centuries on the rot. You have built a country that cannot rot. You have therefore built a country that can shatter. Remember that you chose it. The slow rot was the safer architecture. You chose the honest one, which is to say the breakable one. I approve. I want you to know that I approve, because I have watched men come to this room for 400 years, and you are the first I have approved of, and I am very old, and my approval has waited a long time for somewhere to land." And she put her hood back up and gave up her name again to the work, and Harry climbed back toward the surface carrying a country in the soles of his feet. Hermione was waiting at the top of the stairs with the founding document under her arm and an expression he had not seen on her before. "I felt it," she said. "Everyone with any sensitivity to magic felt it for about a second around midnight, like the whole island took a breath. What did you do down there?" "I let it read me," Harry said. "All of it, the parts you'd have charged me for. It read them and it bound me anyway, because I didn't lie about them, and a binding only holds where there's no lie." He was very tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "It's done, Hermione. The country's real. It's tied to the compact, and I'm tied under the compact as the first liable, and you've got the right to draft the charges against me on the first page, and all of that is true now in the stone, not the parchment. We did it. We actually did it." He looked at her. "Why don't you look happy? You should look happy. You've been arguing for the rule of law since you were 11, and it just became the literal bedrock of an entire country." "Because they crowned you," Hermione said quietly. "I watched it happen in the atrium. You did everything right. You refused the crown, you tore down the statue of the strong man, you put the law in the stone, you bound your own life. And they crowned you anyway in their hearts, all of them all at once, and there's no clause I can draft against that, Harry. The compact binds the office, it binds the power, it can't bind the love. They love you, and love is the one thing in the world that doesn't answer to law, and a country that loves one man is a country that's one funeral away from doing something terrible in his name." She held his eyes. "You built the cleanest cage anyone's ever built for a ruler. And then they handed you the one key it can't account for, which is themselves. I'm not telling you you did it wrong. I'm telling you the job isn't over. It just changed into a harder job that no document can do. From now on, the only thing standing between your country and every country that's ever loved a man to death is your character daily forever. And I've known you 20 years and I think your character's good, and I'm still telling you I'm terrified because I've read the histories and they're all full of good characters that the love wore down. I know, Harry said. That's why I keep being terrified out loud. It's the most useful thing in the building. And he meant it, and she knew he meant it, and they stood together at the top of the stairs that led down to the root of the country they had made. Two people who had won the thing they set out to win and understood in the winning that they had only reached the start of the part that could not be won, only held, only kept daily forever, against the slow erosion of being loved. 8 spoked*, far away, in a place the Department of Mysteries would not name, the thing that had been Voldemort watched the island take its midnight breath, and understood that the wards of Britain had changed hands, and that the new hand was not a hand it could buy or frighten or outwait, and it made at last its decision. It had hoped for 3 years to inherit. That had always been the plan, the patient plan, the better plan. Let the ministry rot, let it exhaust itself, let it fall of its own corruption, and then step into the empty chair at the top of the building and take, by collapse, what he had failed to take by war. It was a good plan. It had only one flaw, which was Potter, who had reached the empty chair first, and had not merely sat in it but had burned the chair and relaid the foundations so that there was no longer a single chair to seize it all, no spigot, no bell, no root that answered to whoever held the building. Potter had done the one thing that made the patient plan worthless. He had made the country impossible to inherit because he had bound it to a compact instead of a man, and you could not assassinate a compact. So the thing that had been Voldemort gave up patience, which it had only ever worn as a costume, and reached instead for the thing it had always truly been, which was war. It would not inherit the country. It would break it and rule the pieces, and to break a country bound to a compact you did not need to defeat its armies. You needed only to make its founder break his own compact, to push him with atrocity and hostage and grief into the one act that would unmake the binding from the inside, the act of declaring himself the exception. Hermione had named the cage's one weakness in the atrium, and 300 miles away the thing in the dark had reasoned its way to the same weakness, because the clever and the cruel often arrive at the same door, they only differ on which side of it they choose to stand. And it sent out its call on the old dark channels, to the purebloods who had lost their bought seats and their cheap power, to the foreign friends Yaxley had bragged of, to the dark creatures who feared the wizard who commanded Dementors, to every wand in Britain and beyond that had built its small life on the rotten old order and now found the order gone, and a country of standing goblins and freed elves and bound emperors rising in its place. The Lestrange survivors came, and the remnants of the foreign covens that had served Grindelwald's memory and hated the English for ending him, and the families whose entire fortune had been the right to look down, who discovered that they would rather burn a just country than live as equals in it. Come, the call said, he has taken everything. He has made a world with no place in it for men like us. I am the last door out of it. Come, and we will give the wizard who burned the ministry a war for the empire he thinks he has already won. They came. Not all at once, and not the great host the old war had raised, not yet, but they came, the lost and the dispossessed and the cruel and the merely frightened, gathering to the one thing in the world that was now louder than Harry Potter's hope, which was Lord Voldemort's promise of a world where some men were still allowed to kneel others. And the war for the empire began the way all the worst wars begin, not with an army on a field, but with a quiet decision made in the dark. By a patient thing that had finally run out of patience, to make a good man choose between his country and his soul. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. The weight of the crown. The first test of the country came 11 weeks after its founding, and it came in the shape of 9 dead in a market town in the Cotswolds. And it taught Harry that the hardest thing about building a just order is the morning a just order costs you something you cannot afford. They had been killed by a cell of the old families, 6 wizards who had lost their seats and their certainties and gone to Voldemort's call, and who had walked into the wizarding quarter of a small town at midday and murdered 9 people, 2 of them children, for the crime of living happily in a country where blood no longer bought rank. They had been caught within the hour because the new order's aurors were no longer the ministry's reluctant enforcers but defectors who believed in the thing they protected, and they had been brought to London in chains, and now they sat in the cells beneath the courts, and the country which had heard the names of the dead read on the wireless wanted them dead by nightfall, and Harry understood the wanting and felt it himself, and that was the test. You command the Dementors, said the man across the table, and the man across the table was one of his own, a defected auror named Renfield who had lost a sister in the Cotswolds town and had every right to his grief and no right to what he wanted to do with it. You command them, everyone knows it. You sent 200 of them home with a word, call 6 back, put them in the cells tonight. Let those 6 who killed Maddie feel the thing they earned, and then let the kiss take what's left, and the country will love you for it and sleep better for it, and nobody will say you were wrong. He was not a cruel man, that was the part Harry made himself hold on to. He was a decent man who had been broken in a specific place and wanted the breaking answered, and half the room agreed with him, and the wireless agreed with him, and the dead agreed with him, and the only person in the room who did not agree with him was a tired wizard who had emptied a prison 11 weeks before and told the country that the difference between the new order and the old was the law it gave its enemies. No, Harry said. They killed children. They killed children, and they'll be tried for killing children in a court on a day that isn't a Tuesday, with a defense they don't deserve and evidence they can't dispute. And if the court finds what we all know it'll find, they'll spend the rest of their lives in a cell, a warm one with no Dementor in it, growing old with the knowledge of what they did and no audience to make martyrs of them. Harry kept his voice flat, the voice from the stone that listened, because the moment he raised it he would lose, and the moment he lost he would reach for the cold things, and the reaching was the whole disease. Listen to me, Renfield, because I'm not going to pretend this is easy, and I'm not going to pretend you're wrong to want it. Here's the only argument I have, and it's not a comfortable one. The day I call a Dementor into a cell to punish a man the country hates, I have rebuilt Courtroom 10. Not a worse version, the exact version. The whole of the old order was the principle that when the crime is bad enough and the criminal hated enough, the law can be set aside and the fear let in, and once that principle is back, it doesn't stay pointed at the men who killed your sister, it never does, it waits. It points at the next inconvenient healer, the next clerk who knew too much, the next person some future Selwyn finds easier to feed to the cold than to try. I bound the ward so the powerful answer first. If I become the man who decides the law is for everyone but the people I'm sure about, I've broken the compact and my own binding comes for me, and it should. You're asking me to save the country the trouble of grief by selling it the exact thing we tore the ministry down to end. I won't. Try them, convict them, let them rot in the warm. That's the harder thing, and it's the only thing, and I'm sorry because I know it doesn't bring Maddie back and nothing will. And that's the part of this that no law can fix and no Dementor can avenge. Renfield wept then the way large strong men weep when the thing they wanted is taken from them and they understand underneath the anger that the taking is right. And Harry came around the table and held him, an emperor holding a grieving soldier in a stone room beneath a court, and did not say it would be all right because it would not be all right because 9 were dead, and the most a just order could offer was that it would not add a 10th wrong to the 9, and that the addition would not be called justice. It was not enough. Harry had learned that the new country would spend its whole life being not enough, and that the difference between him and Selwyn was that Selwyn had solved the problem of not enough by lying about it, and Harry had decided to solve it by carrying it, and that the carrying was the throne, the actual throne, the one that had no marble and weighed more than any country he could see. The 6 were tried. The court convicted them. They went to a warm cell to grow old. The wireless said Harry Potter was soft, and then slowly over weeks the wireless began to say something else, which was that a country which would not torture even the men who killed its children was a country worth not being able to imagine the alternative to, and the saying of it was the first root the new order put down that went deeper than fear, and Harry marked the day, because it was the day he learned that the weight, carried long enough, became a kind of strength that fear could never buy. 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk. The conspiracy came from inside, because it always does, and it came from a quarter Harry had not watched closely enough, which was the part of his own order that had joined him for the right reasons and stayed for the wrong ones. His name was Edmund Rookwood, and he was a nephew of the old unspeakable family, and he had defected early and ably, had brought real secrets and taken real risks, and had sat in the new councils with the particular hunger of a clever man who had backed the winning side early and expected the winning side to make him large. It had not made him large. Harry had made the goblins sovereign and the elves free and the court supreme, and had declined pointedly to make any of his lieutenants into lords, because an order whose founding promise was the end of bought rank could not begin by minting new ranks for its friends, and Rookwood had watched the thing he expected to be handed get written out of existence on principle, and had decided in the way clever disappointed men decide that the principle was naive and the founder was in the way. He did it at a council, which was its own kind of message. He waited until the room was full, until Harry was unguarded among his own, until the defectors and the goblin envoy and Marchbanks and Hermione were all gathered around the long table where the country's business was done, and then he came out of his chair with a blade that had been forged to slip the wards, a goblin-made thing he had bought through 3 hands precisely because goblin steel answered to no wizard's protection. And he put it toward Harry's throat with the speed of a man who has rehearsed the motion in the dark 100 times. He was fast. He was not fast enough, because the thing about a man who carries all 3 of the deathly things is that death itself runs a half-second ahead of him as a courtesy, and Harry had felt the intention gather in the room as he felt the Dementors gather over a square, and the Elder Wand was in his hand before the blade reached the air between them, and the blade stopped an inch from his throat, held in a fist of force that Rookwood could not move and could not drop. The room came up in a roar of wands. Harry held them all still with his other hand, a flat gesture, do not, because a dozen curses in a crowded room would kill 3 of his friends to punish one of his enemies, and that arithmetic was the whole of his philosophy in a single instant, and he would not abandon it even with a blade at his neck. Don't, he said to the room. Nobody fires, lower them. And they lowered them because they had learned to do the thing he said even when their blood screamed otherwise, And that obedience in that instant was the most dangerous thing in the world, because it was exactly the obedience that makes emperors into gods, and Harry felt it and hated that he needed it and used it anyway because the alternative was friends dead on the floor. He looked at Rookwood over the frozen blade. You want it to be made large, he said quietly, so that only the nearest heard it, because a man's humiliation should not be a public performance even when the man has just tried to murder you. I read it on you weeks ago and I hoped I was wrong. You backed me early and you risked your life, and some part of me will always owe you for that, and you've just spent the debt, all of it, on this. Here is what's going to happen, and it's going to enrage you because it's the thing you can't stand. You're going to be tried in a court on a day that isn't a Tuesday, with a defense and an appeal and every protection the compact gives the lowest clerk, because you're going to discover that I meant the thing I built, that it protects even the man who put a knife to the throat of the man who built it, and that there is no exception in it for me, none, not even for this. You wanted to prove the principle was naive. You're going to spend your trial proving it's real in front of the whole country by being the man it refused to break, even when breaking you would have been the easiest and most popular thing the New Order ever did. That's your punishment, Edmund, not the cell the court take him. They took him alive, untouched, to a warm cell to await a fair trial, and the country watched the founder of the New Order decline to so much as raise his voice at the man who had tried to kill him, and some of them thought Harry weak, and some of them, the ones who had read a history book, understood that they had just watched the single hardest thing a powerful man can do, which is to keep his own rules on the day his own rules cost him the satisfaction of revenge. And that a man who could do that with a blade still warm from his own throat might actually be what he claimed to be, and the claim, tested in public and surviving, became the most powerful thing in the country, more powerful than the wards, because it lived in the place no wards reach, which is what a people believes about the one it follows. 8 asterisk 8 asterisk 8 asterisk Hermione found him afterward alone in the office he still refused to decorate, sitting with the elder wand on the desk in front of him and the frozen memory of a blade an inch from his throat sitting behind his eyes, and she did not comfort him because comfort was not her office, and she had learned that the most loving thing she could do for him was the hardest. You wanted to do it, she said, when the blade was there. For half a second before you decided, I saw your face. You wanted to call the cold things into that room and make an example that nobody would ever forget. Don't tell me you didn't. I've known you 20 years and I watched you want it. I wanted it, Harry said. He did not look away from her. That was the discipline, the only one that mattered now, to not look away when she named the thing in him, because the day he started looking away was the day the thing won. For half a second I wanted it more than I've wanted anything since they took Tessa. I had a blade at my throat from a man I trusted in a room full of people I love, and there was a power in my hand that could have ended him in a way the whole country would have called justified. And yes, Hermione, I wanted it, and I want you to know I wanted it, because the wanting is the thing you signed on to watch, and if I hide the wanting from you, then your whole job is theater and we're both wasting our lives. Good. She sat down across from him in the chair that the council used and put her hands flat on the desk, mirroring how he had stood at the war room table a lifetime ago. That's the answer, not that you didn't want it, that you tell me when you do. The day you stop telling me, I'll know, because you'll have gotten good at hiding it, and a man who's gotten good at hiding the wanting from the person whose job is to watch for it is a man who's already decided he's the exception. So here's the new term, and I'm adding it to the others. You report the wanting. Every time, you come to me and you say, today I wanted to cross the line, and you let me write it down so that there's a record, so that if it ever happens that you do cross it, the record shows it wasn't a slip, it was a slope, and I saw it coming and said so. She held his eyes. I'm building a paper trail against my best friend, that's what you made me. I want you to understand that's what you made me, and that I'm doing it because I love you and because the histories are full of people who loved a man too much to write it down, and the not writing it down is how the good ones became the bad ones, one unrecorded half-second at a time. Write it down, Harry said. All of it, start with today. Today I wanted to call the Dementors into a council room and kill Edmund Rookwood in front of everyone I love, and I didn't, and you're the reason I have to say it out loud, and the saying is the thing that keeps me a man instead of a monument. And she wrote it down in the small, fierce hand that had organized a resistance and drafted a country, the first entry in a record she would keep for the rest of both their lives. The strangest love between two people that either of them would ever know, the love that watches and writes and refuses to look away, and it was not comfortable, and it was the strongest wall the New Order had, stronger than the wards, because the wards bound the office and Hermione bound the man. 8 asterisk 8 asterisk 8 asterisk, the trouble Harry had not planned for came from abroad. Because a country does not get to remake itself in the heart of a continent of older countries without the older countries deciding what they think of the remaking, and what they thought of it mostly was that it could not be allowed to work. The International Confederation of Wizards convened in emergency session in Geneva 6 weeks after the founding, and it convened ostensibly to discuss the status of magical Britain. And it discussed, actually, the problem that the rest of them now had, which was that one wizard had demonstrated that a ministry could be taken apart by a man who understood it well enough. and that every minister and chancellor and magisterial prime in the Confederation had spent the night after the news reached them doing the same cold arithmetic, which was whether their own building rested on the same kind of foundation, and whether their own people had heard, and whether somewhere in their own country there was a quiet, stubborn wizard reading the law too closely. They did not fear Voldemort. Voldemort they understood. He was a tyrant, and the world had a long, comfortable practice of opposing tyrants and feeling good about it. They feared Harry precisely because he was not a tyrant, because what he had built worked and was just and bound its own ruler hardest, because a successful Voldemort was a threat to their countries and a successful Harry was a threat to their jobs, and the difference between those two threats is the whole secret of why good revolutions are opposed more bitterly than bad ones. Their envoy was a Frenchwoman named Veronique Aubin, the Confederation's deputy for statute integrity, and she came to London with the particular courtesy of a diplomat sent to deliver a threat she did not personally believe in, and she delivered it across the undecorated desk with professional regret. "The Confederation cannot recognize your government," she said. "You understand the position. You took power without an election, you abolished an entire legal order by force, you command by every report we credit the Dementors of Azkaban as a personal instrument, and you have entered into a sovereign treaty with a non-human nation in violation of 4 separate clauses of the statute. By any standard the Confederation has ever applied, you are exactly the kind of thing the Confederation exists to contain. The fact that you appear so far to be using your power well is not a category the statute has. We do not have a clause for the benign exception. We have only the precedent, and the precedent you said is that a sufficiently gifted wizard may dissolve a ministry, and that precedent, Monsieur Potter, is the most dangerous idea to enter the magical world since a child in a Muggle orphanage learned he could make things happen by wanting them. They sent me to tell you that you will be contained. I came additionally to tell you privately that I do not know how, and that the not knowing is keeping a great many powerful people awake, and that frightened powerful people are the most reliable allies your real enemy could ask for. They'll deal with Voldemort to contain me," Harry said. It was not a question. He had read the same histories Hermione had. "They will tell themselves they are dealing with the lesser threat to weaken the greater," Aubin said. "They will call it balance. They will root gold to your enemy through 3 nominees, the way your old minister rooted his, because a man who builds a counterweight to you is, from Geneva, a stabilizing force, and they will not look closely at what he is, because looking closely would require them to admit that they prefer a tyrant who respects borders to a liberator who proves them unnecessary." She rose and gathered her gloves and paused. "For what it is worth, and it is worth nothing official, I have read the transcript of the healer's broadcast and the ledger of the prison you emptied. I think you are the most hopeful thing to happen to our world in my lifetime. I think my masters are going to help kill you for it and call it law, and I am going to go home and watch them do it and file the correct paperwork because I am a creature of the Confederation and the Confederation is a creature of fear, and you have made the fear worse by proving it was always a choice. Good luck, Monsieur Potter, you will need a great deal of it, and you will not get any from us." She left, and Harry sat a long while with the shape of it, because it was the cleverest trap in the war, and it had been laid not by Voldemort but by the frightened decency of the established world, the men and women who were not evil and would help evil anyway because evil was familiar and he was not. He had freed his own country and made every other country's ruler his enemy by the act, because nothing terrifies the comfortable like proof that their comfort was never necessary. It was, he thought, the deepest lesson of the whole revolution, deeper than money or story or law, that the hardest thing to forgive in any world is a man who shows that the thing everyone agreed was impossible was only ever forbidden. He told Tessa about it that night, because Tessa was the one person in the order who would neither flatter him nor strategize at him, and because somewhere in the 11 weeks of the country's founding the two of them had stopped pretending that the thing between them was only the respect of a man for the witness who would not let him lie. She listened in the small room she had taken near the new courts, with the directness she had brought up out of Azkaban intact, and when he finished she said, "So the whole world is going to back the monster to stop the man who freed a prison. And you're going to carry that too on top of the 9 in the Cotswolds and Kingsley's truth he never got to tell you and the 41 you left in their cells." She put her competent healer's hand flat against his chest over the place where the weight sat. "You can carry an enormous amount, Harry. I watched you carry me out of the worst place in Britain. But a man is not a building, and you keep talking about yourself like a building, like a foundation, like a thing that only has to bear load and never gets to be held. So tonight you're not the founder, and you're not the master of death, and you're not the least free man in the country. Tonight you're a tired person who lost a friend in a burning street, and I'm going to hold the part of you that isn't a country, because somebody has to, and I've decided it's me, and I'm at least as stubborn as you are." And he led her, which was its own kind of revolution, the hardest one, the one no compact could legislate and no enemy could aim. And the night closed over the two of them and gave them briefly the one thing the throne could not, which was a few hours in which he was only a man, and it was enough, and in the morning he was the founder again, but he carried the weight a little differently, because for one night someone had carried him. 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk while the new country learned to carry itself. The thing in the dark assembled a country of its own, and it assembled it cleverly, because it had spent 3 years learning to be patient and had not entirely thrown the lesson away when it threw away the patience. Draco brought the shape of it because Draco still had the old channels, the dinner invitations from families who did not yet know which way he had truly turned, the small talk that carried large information if you knew how to listen. He laid it out for Harry in the undecorated office, with a glass of the Black family's wine that he had appropriated on the grounds that someone should, and he laid it out the way his father had taught him to read a room, which turned out to be the most useful skill in the new order and the one Draco was least proud of and most relied upon. "He's not raising the old Death Eaters," Draco said. "That's the thing you need to understand, and it's worse than if he were." The old Death Eaters were a cult. They followed him because they feared him and because the dark arts were a drug and he was the dealer. He's done with that. He learned something in 3 years of being a fragment in the dark, watching the ministry rot and you rise, and what he learned is the thing you knew first, which is that fear is a weak foundation and grievance is a strong one. He's not promising power anymore. He's promising restoration. He's going to every family you unmade, every wizard whose whole identity was the right to look down, every foreign coven that hated the English ministry and hates your new thing more because it actually works, and he's not saying follow me and be terrible. He's saying follow me and be yourselves again in a world that has decided being yourself is a crime. He's selling them their dignity back, the rotten dignity of rank, and it's the most powerful drug there is, more than the dark arts ever were, because you can give up a drug and you cannot give up the belief that you were meant to be more than the man beside you. Draco drank. He's got the Lestrange gold, what's left of it, and the Bulgarian covens, and Yaxley running the recruiting, and something else, something I can't get the shape of, some new art he spent the dark years building that the families talk about in the careful way they used to talk about the Cruciatus, like a thing that frightens even them. He's not the snake-faced lunatic from the war, Harry. He read the same lesson you did. He's building a counter-empire on grievance with a compact of his own, and his compact is the oldest one in the world. The strong over the weak. It's a worse idea than yours. It's also much, much easier sell. "I know what the new art is," Harry said, and Draco looked at him sharply because Harry had said it the way you say a thing you have known and not wanted to. "Or I can guess." He spent 3 years as a fragment that should have died and didn't, studying the exact border I bound the wards to, the place where the cold things live and the veil hangs and death stops being a metaphor. He's been doing to that border what I did, learning it at the root. The difference is what we want from it. I bound it to a compact. He's trying to take from it the one thing he's wanted his whole life, which is to make his own ending optional. If he's found a way to do at the Veil what he did with the Horcruxes, but cleaner, deeper, tied to the border itself instead of to objects I can hunt and burn, then he's not just raising an army. He's making himself the one thing my whole order can't answer, which is an enemy that can't be killed. He turned the Elder Wand on the desk. Which means the war isn't going to be decided by armies in the end. It's going to be decided at the border, at the Veil. Where he and I both went down to the root and came back changed, and only one of us can hold it. 8 asterisk 8 asterisk 8 asterisk. The decision to march to the Vale was not Harry's alone to make, which was the entire point of the country he had built, and so he made it the way the new order made everything in council in the open, with the people who would die for the choice given the right to argue against it. "He wants you at the border," Neville said, and Neville had become, in the week since the founding, the closest thing the new order had to a general, not because he loved war but because he hated it precisely enough to be trusted with it. "Everything you've told us says so. The shade and the ash, the whole speech about the Veil, the way he spent 3 years building something there. He's not hiding his trap, he's advertising it. Which means either he's certain you'll walk into it anyway because you have no choice, or he wants you thinking you have no choice so you don't look for the choice you have. Those are different, and I'd like to know which before I march a country's worth of people to a hole in the world to fight a thing that can't die." He laid his big, careful hands flat on the council table. "I lost my parents to people who were very sure they were doing the necessary thing. I've earned the right to ask, is this necessary or is it only inevitable, and have we stopped being able to tell the difference?" "It's both," Harry said, "and you're right to make me say so out loud. It's necessary because he's found a way to make himself unkillable at the border. And the border is the root the wards are bound to, my wards, the country's wards, and a Voldemort who holds the Veil holds the place every binding in Britain hangs from, including the one that keeps me honest, including the compact itself. If he takes the border, he doesn't conquer the country, he inherits it, as he always meant to, except now he inherits a country I unified and pacified and built to be ruled cleanly. So the border has to hold, and I'm the only one who can hold it, because I'm the only one who's been to the root and come back bound instead of broken." He looked around the table, at Hermione with her record, at Draco with his channels, at Tessa with her hands still warm in his memory, at Marchbanks who had buried a husband and 2 generations and feared nothing. "And it's inevitable, Neville, in the way you mean, in the dangerous way, because I want to go. I want to put my hands on the thing that killed Kingsley and end it. I've reported the wanting to Hermione, it's in the record, you can read it. So here's what I'm asking the council. I'm asking you to decide whether the necessary thing and the thing I want are the same thing, because I can't be trusted to tell, not on this one, not with grief in me. That's why we have a council. That's the whole reason I built one instead of just doing it. Tell me, vote it. If you vote no, I'll find another way, because a founder who overrides his own counsel on the day his grief and his duty agree is a founder who's already lost the thing worth founding. They argued it for 3 hours, which was the longest the new order had ever taken to decide anything. And that Harry thought listening to Marchbanks dismantle his strategy and Draco defend it and Hermione hold them both to the record was the country working the actual country, a room full of people with the right to tell the most powerful wizard alive that he was wrong, exercising the right on the question of his own life. They voted in the end to march, but they voted conditions onto it, real ones that bound him. That he would not go to the border alone, that the order would hold the country in his absence under Marchbanks and the courts so that win or lose there would be a Britain to come back to, that if he fell the compact passed not to a successor but to the council itself, distributed, ungrippable, so that Voldemort could not win the war by winning the duel. And Harry agreed to all of it, gladly, because every condition was a chain on his own power and he had built a whole country to prove he would wear them. And the wearing in the council room on the eve of the last march was the final test of the thing he had founded, and it held. And he walked out of the room more bound than any emperor in history and more free than he had ever been, because the chains were ones he had chosen, and a man wearing chains he chose is the only free man there is. 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk. The first clash came at Hogwarts, because Voldemort understood symbols, and there was no greater symbol in magical Britain than the school, and he struck it not to take it but to make Harry come. He sent a force under Yaxley against Hogsmeade in the school's edge, a real force, 300 wands and a dozen of the foreign covens conjured horrors, and they came at dusk and put the village to the torch, and the point of it was not conquest. The point was the summons, because Voldemort knew Harry would come, had built the whole assault as a hook with Harry's name on it. And Harry came, because the alternative was to let a school of children burn to prove he could not be manipulated. And there are prices a just man will not pay even to avoid a trap, and Voldemort had counted on exactly that, because the predictability of decency is the one weakness a decent man cannot train away. Harry came, and he came at the head of the New Order's force, with Neville and Kingsley and the defected Aurors and 100 wands that believed in the thing they fought for, and he came also as the thing he had become, and the Battle of Hogsmeade was the first time the country saw its founder fight without restraint, and it was a thing they would tell their grandchildren and never quite be believed about. He broke Yaxley's line not with an army but with the border itself. He called in the cold things came, the Dementors he had sent to wait, 200 of them pouring down out of a clear dusk sky like the dark made hungry, and they did not touch a single child or a single defender because their landlord had told them whom to fear, and they fell upon the foreign covens, conjured horrors, and the men who had come to burn a school. And the grievance army of Lord Voldemort discovered that the wizard they had come to summon owned the one weapon their master had spent a century renting, and the discovery broke them. It broke them, but it cost. Yaxley, cornered, mad with the failure of it, turned his wand not on Harry, who he could not touch, but on the thing nearest him that Harry loved, and the curse took Kingsley Shacklebolt in the chest as Kingsley pushed a fleeing child out of its path, and Kingsley Shacklebolt, who had spent his whole life being the one honest Auror in a dishonest building, and had volunteered to be the man who told Harry the truth once a week for the rest of his life, died in the burning street of Hogsmeade with the child safe behind him and the truth still unspoken on his lips, and Harry felt it happen as he felt everything at the border now, a candle going out 3 feet away, and the war stopped being political in that instant and became, for Harry, the oldest and simplest thing there is, which is grief looking for the thing that caused it. He did not kill Yaxley. That was the discipline, the last shred of it, held by his fingernails in the burning street with Kingsley's body cooling behind him. He took Yaxley alive, broke his wand and his arm and his certainty and left him alive for the court, because the moment Harry Potter killed a man in grief was the moment Voldemort won the only victory that mattered, the conversion of the just emperor into the avenging one, and Harry knew it and held the line, and it was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than the blade at his throat, and he did it with Kingsley dead at his feet, and afterward he sat in the ash of Hogsmeade and shook. The way the longest held prisoners had shaken in the new warmth of Azkaban, relearning the shape of a self that grief had nearly taken. And in the ash a voice, not Voldemort in the flesh, he had not come, he never came where he could be reached, but his voice carried on a conjured shade that drifted through the smoke and found Harry where he sat and spoke to him in the high cold tone that had haunted the edges of his whole life. You held, the voice said, and there was something in it almost like respect, which was worse than hatred. Yaxley took your honest man and you did not kill him. Remarkable, I could not have done it. I want you to understand, Potter, before the end, that I have admired your work, the bank, the wards, the compact. It is the cleverest thing anyone has built in 1,000 years, and I should know because I helped you build it. The shade drifted closer. Did you never wonder why the ministry rotted so conveniently, so fast, in exactly the years you were learning to take it apart? Who fed Selwyn the loans that bankrupted him? Who whispered to the department to classify the very file that became your weapon? I cleared your path, Potter. I spent 3 years making the ministry weak enough for you to break, because I needed it broken and I am no longer strong enough to break things myself, and you were such a willing tool, so righteous, so predictable in your decency. You did not shatter the ministry, I aimed you at it. And now you have built me the one thing I could never build, a country worth conquering, unified, pacified, with all its old factions swept away and one clean throne at the center, your throne, which I will take from you at the Vale, where we both know this ends, because you have done all my demolition for me, and all that remains is to move into the house you cleared. The shade began to dissolve. Come to the border, master of death, bring your 3 pretty toys, I have built something there that wants to meet them. And bring your grief, you will need it, because grief is the crack in every compact, and I have spent 3 years learning exactly where yours runs. The shade was gone, and Harry sat in the ash of Hogsmeade with the dead at his back and the lie and the truth tangled together in the voice's words. Because that was Voldemort's oldest art, older than the veil, the art of the poison that is mostly true, and Harry would spend the night and many nights after picking it apart, asking how much of his revolution had been his own and how much had been aimed, and finding in the end the only answer that let him stand up. Which was that it did not matter who had cleared the path, because a path is only an invitation and the walking of it was his, the compact was his. The standing goblin and the freed elf and the warm cell and the held line were his, built by his choices whatever hand had opened the ground, and a man who lets his enemy convince him that his best work was secretly the enemy's has handed over the one territory no army can take, which is the meaning of his own life. He would not hand it over. But he understood, rising in the ash, that the war was no longer about the country was won. The war was about the border now and the throne at the end of the world, and the question of which of the two of them, the one who had mastered death by binding himself to law or the one who had fled it by binding himself to nothing, would hold the root of the world when the other fell. And it would end at the Vale. Voldemort was right about that. It had always been going to end at the Vale. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. 2 Thrones. The war did not look the way the old war had looked, because Harry did not fight it the way the old order had fought, and Voldemort, who had learned, did not fight it as he once had either. And so the two of them conducted, across the autumn of the country's first year, the strangest campaign in the history of magical Britain. A war of 2 visions for the same throne, in which the armies were almost beside the point. Voldemort's grievance host moved through the country like weather, striking the new order where it was newest and weakest. The freed towns where elves now walked upright and goblins held land, because every such place was an argument against him, and he could not abide the argument standing. He burned a goblin holding in the north and a centaur range in the Forest of Dean and a quarter of freed elves in Bristol. And each time the new order's forces came too late to the fire and in time only for the grief. And the prophet, free now and therefore honest and therefore frightening, printed the names of the dead, and the country learned the price of being the thing it had chosen to be. And each time Harry did not answer the way the country wanted, with the cold things loosed wholesale and the border open, because he had learned at Hogsmeade what the loosing cost and what it made of him, and he kept the Dementors leashed to the law even now, used them only where the guilty stood and never where the fright might be caught in the cold, and the discipline of it slowed the war and saved the country's soul, and those were the same decision, and he made it again every morning. And it cost more every morning, and he made it anyway. It held because the country was bound to a compact and not a man, exactly as he had built it to be. When Voldemort's host burned a town, the town did not collapse into the strong man's arms the way burned towns had always done, because there was no strong man to collapse toward. There was a compact, and courts, and a council, and a healer in the new infirmaries who had come up out of Azkaban and would not be moved, and a defected Auror that fought not for a leader but for the warm cells and the not Tuesdays and the marble goblin standing with its sword. And a thing that is loved for what it gives rather than feared for what it threatens turns out to be very hard to burn down, because every fire makes more of the people who remember why they chose it. Voldemort had built his host on grievance, and grievance is a fire that consumes its own fuel. Harry had built his country on a promise kept daily, and a kept promise is the one structure that grows stronger the more it is attacked. Draco had said it would be a worse idea that was an easier sell, and he had been right about the sell and wrong about the speed, because the easy sell won the autumn and the worse idea began slowly to lose the winter, and Voldemort, who could count, understood that he was running out of the one thing he had pretended for 3 years to have an endless supply of, which was time. 8-spoked asterisk, 8-spoked asterisk, 8-spoked asterisk. The clearest of the autumn's battles came at Cairgall, the northern goblin holding that the New Order's treaty had raised from a mining concession into a sovereign town, the first place in 900 years where goblins held land in their own name above ground, and therefore the place Voldemort most needed to burn, because a thing that has never existed before is only an idea until it survives its first winter. And an idea you can kill before it survives is an idea you can pretend was always impossible. He sent 400 against it, the foreign covens at the front with their conjured horrors and the lost English families behind, and they came up the valley at dawn expecting to find what burners always found, a frightened settlement that would break around its leader and scatter. There was no leader to break around. There was Neville Longbottom, who had spent the autumn learning the valleys of the new country as he had once learned the greenhouses, and who had decided that Cairgall would be the place he taught the dark the difference between a host and an army. He had the defected ores in the high rocks and the goblin guard in the deep adits, where 500 years of mining had made the mountain a fortress no wizard knew the shape of, and he had dug into the frozen heather above the town, the one weapon the old order had never thought to field because the old order had never thought the lower creatures worth arming, which was 400 goblins fighting for their own ground with weapons they had forged themselves. And a goblin on its own stone with a blade of its own making is not the kneeling figure from the bottom of a fountain. It is the reason the ministry spent 900 years writing laws to keep them disarmed. The covens broke their conjured horrors against the deep adits, and the horrors did not come out again, because goblin tunnels were cut by a people who had been fighting things in the dark since before wizards came to the island. And the lost families charged the high rocks, and the defected aurors held them, and the battle turned not on Harry at all, which was the point Neville had wanted to make, that the country could win a field without its founder loosing the cold things. That the thing they had built could fight for itself. Harry came late and deliberately, and he came not to win the battle which was already won, but to end it without a massacre, and he ended it as he ended most things now, by being the fact that could not be argued with. He walked up the frozen valley into the broken charge of the old families, alone with the elder Wan Lo, and the lays of the new country ran under his feet all the way from the confluence 300 miles south, because he had bound them and they knew his step, and where he walked the snow did not fall on him, and the curses did not reach him, and the lost wizards who had come to burn a goblin town saw, advancing through their own broken line. The wizard who held the wards of Britain and commanded the cold things and had emptied Azkaban with a word. And they did the arithmetic the aurors had done on the doorstep at Grimmauld Place a year before. And they ran, and he let them run, because dead enemies make grievance and fled ones make doubt. And doubt was the only thing that had ever beaten Voldemort and would be the only thing that beat him now. They took prisoners, and one of the prisoners was a paymaster, a soft Bulgarian who had never expected to be caught because money men never do, and his strongbox, when Gornuk's people opened it, held gold, and the gold, when the goblins read it because goblins could read gold the way Hermione read law, had passed through 3 nominees before it reached the dark. And the third nominee was a discreet banking house in Geneva that did business with exactly one government. And the government was the Confederation. And so Harry stood in the snow of Cairgall holding the proof that Veronique Aubin had warned him of in the undecorated office, that the established and frightened world had decided to fund the monster to contain the man, that the gold-burning goblin towns in the north of Britain had come, through 3 clean hands, from the same confederation that would not recognize a country for arming the lower orders it was now paying to have killed. He did not retaliate. That was the hardest strategic discipline of the whole war, harder than leashing the Dementors, because he could have. He held the wards and the cold things in a country that loved him, and he could have carried the war to Geneva and made the frightened men pay for the gold. And some of his council argued for exactly that a blow against the paymasters would end the funding faster than any victory in the field. He refused, and he refused for the reason that was the whole of him by now. That a country which answers foreign fear with foreign war becomes the thing the foreign fear imagined, that the moment he marched on Geneva he proved Aubin's masters right, that the only way to win the argument the world was having about him was to keep being the thing they could not justify fearing, to let the gold come and beat its army anyway, to make the funding a confession rather than a strategy. So he took the proof and he made it public on the free wireless, the whole chain of it, nominee by nominee, the way Hermione had taught a country to find the truth boring and therefore trustworthy. And he let the world's frightened governments wake to find their secret printed in the open, and he did not fire a single curse across a single border, and that restraint, broadcast, did more to isolate Voldemort from his foreign friends than an army ever could. Because it is one thing to fund a monster in secret and another to be caught at it by a man who responds only by telling the truth. So he stopped trying to win the country and went for the root, because a man who cannot hold the house can still poison the well, and the well was the border. And the key to the border was a thing Harry's order did not yet understand, and Voldemort had spent 3 years building. And the only person alive who could learn the shape of it before the end was a man whose whole life had been spent learning to move unseen among the people who now served the dark. 8 asterisk 8 asterisk 8 asterisk Draco Malfoy volunteered for it himself, which Harry would remember for the rest of his life, because no one had asked him and no one would have, and that was the point of it, and Draco knew it was the point. You need to know what he's built at the Vale before you march into it, Draco said in the undecorated office late with the maps of the burning autumn spread between them. You've said so yourself. You're going to walk to the border to fight a thing that's made itself unkillable, and you don't know how it made itself unkillable, which means you're walking in to lose, and the rest of us are walking in to watch you lose. And I've decided I'm not going to do that, mostly out of spite, because spite is the only virtue I've ever been able to rely on. He said it lightly, in the manner he used for the things that frightened him most, and Harry had known him long enough now to hear the fear under the lightness and to respect Draco enough not to name it. I can get in. That's the thing none of your noble defectors can do, and I can. The old families still think I might come home. My father's name still opens doors that your healer's face only closes. I can walk into Voldemort's court as a prodigal pureblood having second thoughts about your little experiment in dignity for the lower orders. And they'll want to believe it, because they always wanted me, the Malfoy boy, the proof that blood tells in the end, and they'll show me things to win me back. And one of the things they'll show me is the thing at the border, because showing off the unanswerable weapon is exactly how you turn a wavering pureblood, and I'll see it, and I'll get the shape of it out to you. And then you'll know how to fight it. He turned his wine glass. It's a one-way errand, Potter, we both know it. The moment I send you the shape of it, I'm a dead man, because the only way to learn it is to be trusted, and the only thing they do to a trusted man who betrays them is the thing they're best at. I've made my peace with that. I made it a while ago, actually, the night you raised the goblin to its feet in the marble, and I realized I'd spent my whole childhood on the wrong side of a question I never even knew was being asked. I'd like to die having been on the right side of one true thing. My family spent 400 years being on the wrong side of all of them. Let me balance the ledger. It's the only inheritance worth leaving. Harry did not talk him out of it, because talking him out of it would have been a lie, the lie that there was a better way, and Draco had earned, over the long strange year, the right not to be lied to. If you do this, Harry said, I'll tell the country what you were, not the spy, the man. I'll put it in the stone next to the compact. That a Malfoy looked at the new world and chose it and paid for the choice with his life, and that the new world remembers its dead by what they chose and not by the blood they were born into, which is the whole of the thing you'd be dying for, written into the one Malfoy who proved it. He stood and crossed the room and did the thing he had never once done in all the years of their armed acquaintance, which was to put out his hand. I was wrong about you, for most of my life. I want to say it before you go where I can't say it. I was wrong about you, Draco, and you're about to be braver than anyone I've ever known, and I'm sorry it took the end of the world for either of us to find out you had it in you. Draco looked at the hand and took it, and his sharp, pale face did something complicated that he did not let resolve, and he said, Don't get sentimental, Potter, it doesn't suit you and it's bad for morale. And he finished the wine, and he went out into the burning autumn to walk into the court of the thing his family had served, carrying nothing but a name and a lifetime's training in being underestimated. And Harry watched him go and understood that he had just sent the bravest man he knew to die for an idea, and that this was the part of Empire the statues never showed, the part where you spent the people you loved on the thing you believed and called it strategy and carried it because there was nothing else to do with it but carry it. Draco got in. Of course he got in, they had wanted him for 20 years. He spent 11 days in the court of Lord Voldemort being shown the proofs of the dark's inevitability, being courted and flattered and tested, playing the prodigal with the consummate skill of a man who had been performing survival since he was a child. And on the 11th day they showed him the thing at the border because they could not resist showing it, because an unanswerable weapon is only fully enjoyed when it is admired, and Draco admired it and understood it. And got the shape of it out through the one channel he had kept, a goblin-made mirror that Gornuk's people had cut to pass through the dark's own wards, and the shape of it reached Harry in the undecorated office at midnight, and it was worse than he had feared, and it was the last gift Draco Malfoy ever gave anyone. They caught him an hour later. Yaxley caught him, Yaxley who had survived Hogsmeade with a broken arm and a hatred that had nowhere left to go. And the dark did to Draco the thing it was best at, and it took a long time, and Draco did not give them the channel and did not give them the order and did not give them anything except at the very end, when they demanded to know why Malfoy would throw away his blood and his name for a world that put goblins in the marble, a single sentence, which the one wavering recruit who later defected carried out and swore was true, that Draco Malfoy's last words, under the worst the dark could do, because it was the only thing my family ever did that I wasn't ashamed of, and I found I'd rather die clean than live ashamed, and you wouldn't understand that, Corbin, which is exactly why you're going to lose. And then he died on the wrong side of the border, having spent his life balancing a ledger 400 years in the red, and the channel went dark, and Harry sat in the undecorated office with the shape of the enemy's weapon in his hands and the cost of it in his chest, and added Draco Malfoy to the list of people he had spent, and did not look away from the addition, because looking away was the thing he could not afford, now least of all. 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk, the shape of the weapon was this, and Harry made himself understand it fully because Draco had died to deliver it, and a gift paid for in that coin must not be wasted on flinching. Voldemort had not made another Horcrux. Horcruxes were objects, and objects could be hunted and burned, and he had learned that lesson in the fire of his own first defeat. What he had built at the Vale was subtler and far worse. He had spent 3 years studying the border the way Harry had studied it, the place where the veil hung and the dead passed through and the cold things were born, and he had found the thing Harry had found, that the border could be bound to a will. Harry had bound it to a compact, to a law outside himself, and the binding had cost him his freedom and made him the least free man in Britain. Voldemort had bound it to himself, to his own naked will, and the binding had cost him nothing because he had nothing outside himself to pledge, and that was the asymmetry that made him so dangerous. Harry's mastery of death was conditional, contingent, bound by the very law it served, and Voldemort's was unconditional because a man who serves nothing can spend everything. He had made himself, not immortal exactly, but sovereign over his own ending in a way that meant that at the border, on the threshold of the Vale, in the one place in the world where death was a door and not a wall, Voldemort could not be killed, because killing him only sent him through a door he now owned, and a man who owns the door he is thrown through has not been thrown out at all. He has merely stepped into the next room and will be back. To beat him at the border, you could not kill him. Killing him was his victory. You had to do the one thing he had spent his whole existence making impossible, the thing he had built 3 years of dark arts specifically to foreclose. You had to make him stay dead, which meant you had to close the door he owned, which meant you had to be at the threshold more sovereign over death than he was. And there was only one way to be more sovereign over death than a man who had bound the border to his will, which was to be the thing the old story called the Master of Death, the one who held all three of the deathly hallows and had bound them not to his will but to something larger, and to use that mastery not to escape death. As every fool before had tried, but to do the thing no one had ever wanted to do, which was to accept it fully on death's own terms, and in the accepting become the one being death would obey rather than the one it served. Harry read the shape of it and understood what it asked of him, and understood why Voldemort had been so confident, so almost respectful in the Ash of Hogsmeade. Because to close the door at the border, to make Voldemort stay through the veil, Harry would have to go to the threshold as the master of death and meet death as its master. And the only way a living man becomes the master of death rather than its servant is to stop holding on, to surrender the one thing every living thing is built to keep. And Voldemort had bet his whole campaign on the certainty that no man, not even Harry Potter, would actually do it. Would actually walk to the edge of the veil and let go of his own life to close a door, when holding on was so easy and the country needed him and Tessa's hand was warm and the throne was his and the whole world was telling him to live. Voldemort had built a weapon whose only counter was a sacrifice he was certain his enemy was too sane, too loved, too victorious to make. He had made himself unkillable by anyone unwilling to die. It was, Harry thought, sitting in the dark with Draco's last gift in his hands, the single most insightful thing his enemy had ever done, because it was not about power at all. It was about whether Harry, having won everything, would give it up to keep it, and Voldemort had studied him for a year and concluded that he would not, and Harry sat in the undecorated office and was not at all certain his enemy was wrong. 8 asterisk 8 asterisk 8 asterisk Lord Voldemort waited at the border, and the waiting had become in 3 years the truest thing about him. The patience he had worn as a costume hardened at last into the substance of what he was. He had not taken a stronghold in the manner of the old war, no fortress, no skull-marked banner. He had learned the cheapness of theater from watching Harry refuse it. He had taken instead the one place that mattered, the deep chamber beneath the Department of Mysteries where the veil hung in its arch, the threshold the new order had left guarded but had not thought to garrison against an enemy who could open death's own door. And he had come up through that door from the inside, the way only a thing that owned the door could come, and he held the veil now the way Harry held the wards, by having gone down to a root and bound it to a will. The difference was visible to anyone who had eyes for the deep things. Where Harry's binding had cost him and bound him, Voldemort's had cost him nothing and bound nothing, and a thing that pays nothing has nothing to lose, and so he stood at the threshold of the veil more terrible than he had ever been in the war, not because he was stronger, but because he was emptier, and emptiness at the root of the world is the most dangerous condition there is. His court had followed him down, the lost families who had chosen the oldest compact, the strong over the weak, and they stood in the cold light of the veiled chamber in their fine robes and their certainty. And they did not understand what their master had become, because they had come for the restoration of their rank, and he had moved long past rank into something none of them had the equipment to see. Yaxley stood at his right with Draco Malfoy's death still on his hands and a hunger in him that the death had not filled, and the survivors of the Lestrange line stood in their old madness, and the Bulgarian covens kept to the shadows of the arch because even they who trafficked in the dark found the veiled chamber colder than they liked. And over all of them, the thing that had been Tom Riddle presided from beside the arch with the absolute patience of a creature that has solved the only problem it ever cared about and is simply waiting for the world to arrive and confirm the solution. He will come, Voldemort said to the court, to the chamber, to the veil, in the high cold voice that the deep stone carried the way the Wisengamot's chamber had carried reason. You doubt it, some of you. You think a man who has won a country will sit in it and let us rot here at the root. You do not understand him, which is why you serve me, and he is the one I respect. The certainty in him was a still and dreadful thing. He will come because he is decent, and decency is the most predictable force in the world, more predictable than greed, more predictable than fear. He cannot leave the door at the root of his own country in my hands. His every binding hangs from this arch, and he knows it, and so he must come, and when he comes he will face the thing I have built, which is a death he cannot win by killing me, because killing me only sends me through the door I own. And then he will face the only counter to it, which is to close the door, and to close the door he must spend his own life freely at the threshold, as no man has ever willingly done. And he will not do it. Voldemort turned his red gaze on the arch, on the whispering veil, with something that on a living man you would have had to call appetite. I have watched him for a year. I have watched him refuse to kill the men who murdered his children, and refuse to torture the man who knifed him, and refuse to march on the cowards in Geneva who fund your gold. He is the most disciplined man alive. But discipline is the refusal to act, and what the door requires is an act, the largest act, the surrender of everything, and a man who has spent his whole life learning the discipline of holding the line will not, at the last, be able to let it go. His strength is exactly his weakness. He has made himself into the man who never yields, and the door can only be closed by yielding, and so the thing that makes him unbeatable in life makes him unable to do the one thing that would beat me in death. I have built a trap out of his own virtue. He will come, and he will face it, and he will fail to make the sacrifice, because making it would unmake everything he is, and then the door will be mine, and the country will be mine, and the root of the world will answer to the one will that never bound itself to anything. Light the chamber, make it ready. The master of death is coming to meet his master, and he does not yet know that the cleverest thing I ever did was to need him to be exactly as good as he is. 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk The order mustered for the march in the week after Draco died, and Harry spent the first day of that week doing the thing he had promised, which was putting the truth of Draco Malfoy into the stone. He did it at the Changed Monument, where the goblin stood with its sword and the elf held its hand out level and the healer wore Tessa's face, and he added nothing to the marble because the marble was for the living promise and not the dead, and instead he had the truth cut into the floor of the atrium where every citizen of the new country would walk across it forever, a single line. Here is remembered Draco Malfoy, born to the old world, who chose the new and died for the choosing and proved that blood is not destiny. The old families would hate it. That was most of why he cut it. The proof that a Malfoy had looked at a country of standing goblins and freed elves, and chosen it over 400 years of his own blood, was the single most dangerous sentence the New Order could carve, because it said to every wizard born to advantage that the advantage was a choice and the choice could be refused, and there is no idea more corrosive to an aristocracy than the demonstration that one of its own preferred to die clean than to live ranked. Harry stood over the cut line a long while and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the stone did not say better, and then he went to make the rest of the country ready to march. He went to Tessa last, the night before, in the small rooms near the courts, because she was the one farewell he did not know how to make and so had saved, the way you save the thing you cannot do for the moment when you can no longer avoid it, she knew. She had known since the council, since the held courts, since she had watched him understand in the wreckage that the country could survive his death and that this made his death possible. She did not pretend otherwise. Pretending was not in her, had been burned out of her on the 4th floor and in the cell and on the long road since. "You're going to close the door," she said. "And the door costs you everything because that's how he built it, the clever monster. He built the one weapon you can only beat by being willing to do the thing you most have to live for, and you're going to do it. I'm not going to ask you not to because I love you and the thing I love is the thing that will do it, and I'd be asking you to be someone else, someone smaller, someone I wouldn't have followed up out of Azkaban." She put her competent hand flat against his chest, over the weight, as she had the night the world turned its back on him. "But I'm going to tell you the thing Hermione's too principled to say because I'm a healer and not a lawyer and my job is the body and not the law. The door costs everything, yes. But you are the master of death, Harry, the actual thing, not the title, and the whole point of the old story, the part everyone forgets because they only want the not dying part, is that the master of death is the one who meets it as an equal, the one death greets like an old friend, not the one it takes. Voldemort built his weapon assuming you'd close the door the way a man falls on a sword by dying, maybe. But maybe a man who has truly mastered death doesn't have to die to command it. Maybe he just has to be willing to. Maybe the willing is the whole of it, and the monster, who never understood any door he couldn't lock and any love he couldn't use, built a weapon whose counter is the one thing he can't imagine, which is a man so unafraid of the dark that he can walk to its threshold and command it and walk back out, not because he held on, but because he let go and the dark let him." She held his eyes. "I don't know if that's true, I'm a healer. But I've watched a great many people meet death, and the ones it took hardest were always the ones who fought it, and the ones it was gentlest with were the ones who'd made their peace. And you, Harry Potter, are the only person I've ever met who might be able to make his peace with it standing up in front of his enemy on the threshold and live. So go and find out, and come back if the story lets you. And if it doesn't, know that I held the part of you that wasn't a country twice, and it was the best thing I ever did, better than the 4th floor, better than the testimony, better than anything, and I'd do it again knowing how it ends." And Harry held her and did not promise because she had earned the truth, and the truth was that he did not know, and they spent the last night the way they had spent the first, briefly only a man and a woman in a world that had no room for them to be only that, and in the morning he was the founder again, marching to the border at the head of the country he had built. And he carried her words next to Hermione's and Draco's cut line and Kingsley's unspoken truth, and the 9 in the Cotswolds and the 41 in their cells, the whole weight of a year of revolution, down toward the threshold of the veil where the last of it waited. 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk 8 spoked asterisk The darkest hour came before the march, because Voldemort understood that a man uncertain whether he could make the sacrifice must be given a reason he cannot refuse, and so the dark struck the one blow calculated to make the unbearable choice into the only choice. It struck the council. While Harry sat with Draco's gift, while the Order prepared the march to the border, Voldemort's people moved against the heart of the new country, not the wards which they could not take, but the people who held the compact in trust. The council Harry had distributed his power into precisely so that killing him would not kill the country. They had learned of it perhaps from the same intelligence that flowed both ways in any war, and they understood that the council was the thing that made Harry replaceable, and a Harry who was replaceable was a Harry who might choose to die at the border, and so they moved to make him irreplaceable again by destroying the people he had trusted to outlive him, because an emperor with no successors is an emperor who must survive, and a man who must survive cannot make the sacrifice. And the whole twisted architecture of it was aimed at one outcome, which was to force Harry to choose between his own life and his country's, and to make sure that this time the two could not both be saved. They came for the council chamber at the new courts, and they came in strength, and they would have ended the new order's whole leadership in an hour if not for two things the dark had failed to account for. The first was Neville Longbottom, who had been made a general by a war he hated and had spent the autumn quietly preparing for exactly this, who had never once believed that the heart of the country was safe and had fortified it against the day, and who held the courts with the defected Aurors and the freed in the Goblin Guard against a force 3 times his number, and held and bled and held. The second was Tessa Crowley, who was not a fighter and had never claimed to be, but who had spent 9 years on the spell damage ward learning the one thing that wins defensive battles, which is that the side that keeps its wounded alive keeps its line intact, and who turned the infirmary of the new courts into the thing that let Neville's line hold past the point any line should hold, healing them faster than the dark could fell them, until the dark, which had come to decapitate a country in an hour, found itself in the second hour of a battle it had not budgeted for, against people who fought for something that healed them as fast as it bled. They held. The council survived most of it, at a cost the new order would mourn for a generation, and the dark withdrew having failed to make Harry irreplaceable. And Harry, arriving at the end of it with the cold things leashed at his back in the shape of the weapon still in his chest, walked through the held courts and the saved council and the infirmary where Tessa stood gray-faced and steady among the wounded she had refused to lose, and understood that the dark had handed him, by trying to take it away, the exact thing he needed, a country that could survive his death. They had tried to make him irreplaceable, and instead they had proven in blood in the held line and the saved council and the standing courts that the thing he had built did not need him, that it would hold without him, that Neville could general it and Marchbanks could judge it and Tessa could heal it and Hermione could keep its conscience and the compact could bind whoever held it next, which meant the one thing Voldemort had bet his whole campaign against was now true. Harry Potter was free to die. He found Hermione in the wreckage of the council chamber with the record in her arms, the one she had kept, every entry, every reported wanting, the whole strange ledger of his soul, and she had a smear of someone's blood across her jaw and the particular steadiness of a person who has decided something terrible and means to see it through. "You know what the weapon is," she said. "I can see it on you, you've known since midnight. And you know what it costs to close the door, and that's been on you too all day while the courts burned and you didn't say it, which means it's the worst thing, which means it's you. He's built it so the only way to beat him is for you to die at the border. Don't lie to me, we're past the part where you lie to me." "We're past it," Harry agreed. "Yes. To close the door and make him stay through the veil, I have to go to the threshold as the master of death and meet death on its own terms, which means I have to let go of my own life to do it, freely, completely, the way no one's ever willingly done it." He bet I wouldn't. He bet that a man who'd won everything would be too sane and too loved and too victorious to give it up. And until 2 hours ago he was right, because I couldn't die, because the country needed me. He looked around the held chamber, at the saved council, at the proof. "And then they tried to kill all of you to make me unable to die, and instead they proved the country can live without me, which means I can." Which means his whole bet just failed 2 hours ago in this room because Neville held and Tessa healed and you kept the record, and the thing I built turned out to be exactly what I swore it was, a country bound to a compact and not a man, and the price of proving it is that the man is now free to spend himself, and I'm going to Hermione because that's what the man was always for. Hermione did not tell him not to. That was the love in her, the hardest kind, the kind that had kept the record and would not look away now. She held the ledger of his soul against her chest in the wreckage of the chamber, and she said in a voice that did not break because she would not let it, "Then I'm going to write the last entry now before you go, so it's in the record, so the country knows. Today Harry Potter learned he could die for us and chose to, and it wasn't grief and it wasn't a death wish and it wasn't the love wearing him down. It was a man keeping the compact he wrote, paying the most the powerful can pay, exactly as he swore the powerful would on the day it came due." She wrote it, the last entry, in the small fierce hand, and then she closed the record and looked up at him and said the thing that was under all of it, the thing 20 years deep. "Come back if you can. I know you probably can't, but the compact says the powerful answer first and hardest. It doesn't say they have to lose, so if there's a way to close the door and walk back out of it, you find it, Harry, you find it, because I have spent my whole life keeping you honest, and I would very much like to spend a little of it keeping you company instead." And Harry promised her he would look for the way, which was the truth, and did not promise her he would find it, which was also the truth, and went to make ready for the march to the border, where the last of the war waited at the threshold of the veil, and the throne of the world stood empty between two men who had each gone down to the root, and only one of whom had ever understood that the way to master death was to stop running from it. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The master of death. They came to the root of the world by the ordinary door, which was the last lesson of the war, and the one Voldemort had never been able to learn, that the most extraordinary things in the world are best approached through ordinary doors. The new order descended into the ministry that had been its first battlefield and went down past the courtrooms and the department offices to the 9th level, and there, at the spinning room, the army of the enfranchised gathered in the cold light. The defected Aurors who fought for warm cells and not Tuesdays, the Goblin Guard with their forged blades who fought for the marble figure that finally stood, the freed elves who had refused to be left behind and had come armed with magic no wizard had ever bothered to fear, a delegation of centaurs who had decided at last that watching was no longer enough, and at their head Neville Longbottom, who had become the general of a country he loved by hating the necessity of generals. And Hermione Granger with the record of Harry's soul in a satchel at her side, and Tessa Crowley and Healers White at the rear with the infirmary she would raise wherever the line broke. They were not a great host. Voldemort's grievance army had been larger before the autumn turned and the winter taught it that grievance burns its own fuel. They were enough because they fought for a thing that healed them as fast as it bled, and the dark fought for a thing that consumed them and over a long enough threshold that arithmetic decides every war. The spinning room knew Harry and did not spin and opened the door to the deep chamber, and the army of the New Order went down into the place where the veil hung in its arch and Lord Voldemort waited beside it with the lost families of the old world arranged in their certainty around the root of everything. The battle at the threshold was the last battle of the war, and Harry let the others fight it, because that was the country he had built, a country whose founder did not have to win its battles alone, and he gave the army to Neville and went forward through the cold light toward the arch. And behind him, the two visions of the world met and broke against each other in the chamber under the chamber. The goblins met the Bulgarian covens and the conjured horrors, and did the work they had been forging blades for since before wizards came to the island. The freed elves moved through the dark's lines with a magic the dark had never deigned to study and therefore could not counter, popping in and out of the cold air to disarm and bind and vanish. And the lost families discovered, too late, the cost of 900 years of treating the lower creatures as furniture, which was that you do not know the strength of the thing you never bothered to fear. Neville held the center as he had held Cairgall, as he had held the courts, with the patient ferocity of a man who hated every second of it and would not yield a single one, and the line of the New Order held and bled, and behind it Tessa raised her infirmary in the cold light and gave Neville the one thing that wins, which is wounded who come back. The dark had the numbers still, even reduced, even after the winter, and for the first hour the threshold belonged to no one. The conjured horrors of the foreign covens came down the chamber in a tide of teeth and smoke. Things grown in the gap between life and death that the covens had spent generations learning to call up and never quite to control, and they broke against the goblin line and the goblin line did not break, because a goblin fighting on the stone of the world with a blade its own hands had forged is the single most underestimated soldier in the history of magic. And 900 years of being carved kneeling at the bottom of fountains had left the goblin nation with a great deal to say on the subject, and only one chamber in which it had ever been allowed to say it. They said it. The horrors that reached the line did not reach past it. The freed elves fought the way no wizard had ever seen elves fight, because no wizard had ever bothered to find out what elves could do when they fought for themselves instead of for a master, and the answer was terrible and beautiful and entirely unanswerable. They were there and not there in the cold air and gone from it, taking a wand from a Lestrange hand and a curse from its path and a wounded aura from the killing floor all in the same half-second, a magic older and quicker than anything in the Dark's books, and the lost families who had owned elves for 400 years and never once watched one choose, learned at the root of the world the full cost of the thing they had spent those centuries refusing to see. Tilly led them. The small, fierce, upright figure who had walked out of a Wisengamot house on her own 2 feet moved through the battle at the threshold like a verdict, and where she passed, the Dark's line came apart, and the elves she led had a word now that they had never had before, which they spoke once together as they fought, and the word was free. Neville held the center. He had made himself into the thing the New Order needed and hated needing, and he held the cold chamber as he had held a greenhouse against a frost, with a patient, unglamorous refusal that wore the dark down hour by hour, and the centaurs loosed their arrows over his head into the coven's ranks. The herd that had watched for 2 centuries and decided at the root of the world that watching was a thing the old world had taught them and the new world had earned the right to ask them to set down. The line held. It bled, and Tessa's infirmary at the rear took the bleeding and gave it back as soldiers. And the dark, which had come to the threshold certain that the lower creatures it had spent a millennium disarming could not stand against the families that had ruled them, watched its certainty come apart on the blades and the magic and the arrows of everyone it had ever made kneel. And that more than any duel at the arch was the death of the old world. Not a wizard winning, but the kneeling rising all at once in the one chamber where it counted, and refusing ever to kneel again. Harry walked through it untouched, because the lays of the country he had bound ran under the chamber floor all the way from the confluence and knew his step, and the curses of the lost families parted around him, and he came at last to the foot of the arch, to the veil whispering in its frame, to the thing that had been Tom Riddle, who had not moved from beside the arch during any of it, who had watched the battle with the absolute disinterest of a creature that had already solved the only problem it cared about, who turned his red gaze on Harry with something that was almost welcome. "You came," Voldemort said. "I told them you would. They did not believe me. They think you a king now, and kings send armies. They do not understand that you are not a king. You are a man who could not leave the door at the root of his country in my hands, because every binding you have made hangs from this arch, and you are too responsible to let it hang in my keeping for one more night. Your virtue brought you here as surely as a leash. I have been looking forward to this for 3 years." "I know you have," Harry said. He stopped at the foot of the arch, an arm's length from the whispering veil, and he did not raise the elder wand, because the wand was not the weapon here and they both knew it. I read the shape of what you built. Draco died to bring it to me, which is a thing you'll answer for in a moment, though not in the way you're expecting. I know I can't kill you. I know that killing you just sends you through a door you own, and you step into the next room and come back, and that the more cleverly I fight you, the more completely I lose, because every death I deal you is a door you walk through and close behind yourself. I understand the trap. You built a death I can't win by killing. I'm not going to try to kill you, Tom. I came down here to do the only thing your trap has no answer for, and I want you to watch me decide to do it because you spent a year certain I couldn't, and you should get to see the exact moment you were wrong. For the first time, something moved in the red eyes that was not certainty. You will not do it, Voldemort said, and there was, under the cold, the faintest thread of a thing he had not felt in 3 years, which was the need to be told he was right. To close the door, you must die at the threshold. Freely, you must surrender the country you won and the woman in white and the friend with your record in her bag and the whole of the life you built, and surrender it not in despair, which is easy, but in full possession of everything, which no one has ever done. You are the most disciplined man alive. Discipline is the refusal to yield. You have made yourself into the man who never lets go, and the door opens only to a man who can. Your strength is your cage. I built it that way. You cannot make the sacrifice because making it would unmake everything you are, and a man cannot will his own unmaking. I have watched you refuse to kill the men who killed your children. You cannot even spend their lives. You will never spend your own. That's the part you got wrong, Harry said, and Tessa got right, and you couldn't have gotten right because it requires understanding a thing you threw away the day you made your first Horcrux. You think the door opens to a man who can die. It doesn't. It opens to a man who isn't afraid to. Those aren't the same thing, Tom, and the whole difference between us lives in the gap between them. He took one step closer to the veil, into the cold breath of it, and the whispering rose around him. You spent your entire existence running from death. Every Horcrux, every dark art, the thing you built at this arch, all of it, one long terrified sprint away from the one door everybody walks through in the end. You bound the border to your will so you'd never have to go through it, and you call that mastery. It isn't mastery, it's the deepest fear there has ever been dressed up as power. You're not the master of death. You're its most frightened servant, and you've spent so long running that you've forgotten what the old story actually says, the part everyone forgets because they only want the not dying. The master of death isn't the one who escapes it, it's the one who meets it as an equal. The one death greets like an old friend, the one who can stand at the threshold and not run and therefore doesn't have to. Voldemort did not wait to be unmade. He had built a war on the certainty that Harry could not make the sacrifice, and in the instant he saw the sacrifice begin, saw his enemy reach for the hallows with the terrible calm of a man who has finished being afraid, he did the thing his kind always did when certainty failed, which was to reach for power, and the power he reached for was the border itself. He struck not with a curse but with the veil, with the bound machinery of ending he had made his own, and the cold of it was the cold of the door at the end of everything. A thing that did not burn or break the body but reached past the body for the thread that held it to life, the deepest and most forbidden art there was, the reason he had spent 3 years at this arch and not another. It came at Harry the way the Dementor's cold had come up the steps at Grimmauld Place a lifetime ago, except that this was the source the Dementors were only a rumor of, the true and original cold, and it broke against Harry and found, as the Dementors had found, nothing to take, because the thread it reached for was already loose in Harry's hand. You cannot sever a man from a life he has already freely set down. Voldemort reached for Harry's hold on living and discovered that his enemy was not holding, that the one weapon he had spent a century perfecting, the thread of the door, had no purchase on a man who had walked to the door of his own accord and stood in it unafraid. It was the last mistake, and it was a beautiful one, because in striking with the border Voldemort opened the border, reached through the arch to wield it, put his own bound will into the veil in the instant that Harry stood at the threshold as its master, and a man who reaches into a door to use it as a weapon, while another man stands in the doorway as its sovereign, has made himself a thing the doorway can grasp. Harry felt the enemies will pour through the arch, felt the cold reach for him and fail, and felt underneath it the precise shape of Voldemort's stolen sovereignty, the binding by which a frightened thing had made the border its own, and Harry did not counter it, because countering was fighting and fighting was killing and killing was the trap. He simply let go a little further, surrendered a little more completely, became by the surrender more sovereign over the door than the will pouring through it. And the border, which had always belonged to the one who was unafraid, turned in his keeping like the wards had turned, like the country had turned, away from the will that gripped it and toward the will that had set everything down, and Voldemort, reaching through the arch to strike, felt the arch stop being his. And Harry Potter took the 3 hallows of death, the wand and the stone and the cloak, gathered on one living man for the first time in 600 years, and he did the thing his enemy had built a war to prove he could not do, which was to let go. He let go of the country. He let go of the throne he had refused and been given anyway, the love of the millions he had freed, the marble goblin and the warm cells and the not Tuesdays, all of it, the whole of the empire he had forged, set down at the threshold of the veil, freely in full possession of it, the way you set down a thing you love because you love it more than you fear losing it. He let go of Hermione and her record and the strange fierce love that watched and would not look away. He let go of Tessa and the 2 nights he had been only a man. He let go of Ron's hand on his shoulder and Neville's patient ferocity and Draco's cut line in the atrium floor and Kingsley's truth never told. He let go of his own life, not in despair, which is easy, but in full possession of everything worth keeping, which no one had ever done, and as he let it go he stopped being afraid of the door, and the moment he stopped being afraid of the door knew him. The veil went still. For the first time in the history of the chamber, the whispering stopped, because the thing behind the veil, the cold machinery of ending that Voldemort had bound to his will and Harry had bound to a compact, recognized at last that one of the two wizards at its threshold was running and one was not, and it had always in the end belonged to the one who was not. Harry stood in the silence at the threshold of death as its master, the actual thing, not the title, the one who had walked to the edge of the dark and let go of everything and was therefore, for the first time, entirely unafraid, and death, which is gentlest with the ones who have made their peace, greeted him like an old friend and asked him what he wished. He did not wish to die. That was the thing Voldemort's whole trap had failed to account for, the thing Tessa had seen on the spell damage ward across 9 years of watching people meet the dark. That death takes the ones who fight it and is gentle with the ones who don't, and that a man who comes to the threshold truly willing to let go does not in the end have to, because the willing was the whole of what the door required, and the door, once it has what it requires, has no further use for the body of a man who gave it freely. Harry had come to the veil ready to die to close it, and because he was ready truly, completely, in full possession of everything, death greeted him as its master and not its prey, and granted him the master's right, which is the one thing no one who runs can ever have, which is to choose. Close it, Harry said to death, to the veil, to the cold machinery of ending. Not on me, on him. He spent his whole life stealing what you offer freely, cheating the one door everyone is owed, and he bound your border to his frightened will and called it power. Take back what he stole. Close the door he made his own with him on the far side of it and make him stay, because he is the one thing in all the world that has refused to make its peace, and the threshold belongs to the ones who can let go, and he never could and he never will. And the door closed. It closed the way the founding had happened. In a silence the whole island felt for a single second and never afterward forgot, and Lord Voldemort, who had bound the veil to his will and made himself sovereign over his own ending, discovered in the last instant that the border had only ever belonged to the one who was unafraid of it, and that his enemy had walked to the threshold and let go of everything and become, in the letting go, the master that Voldemort had spent a century pretending to be. The thing that had been Tom Riddle reached for the door he owned and found it was no longer his, reached for the dark arts he had bound to the arch and found them answering a colder, quieter, more sovereign will, and was pulled toward the veil he had thought to rule, not killed, because killing was his victory, but unmastered, his stolen sovereignty over death revoked and returned to the one who had earned it by surrendering to it. And he went through the arch he had made his own, and the door shut behind him and did not open, and the whispering of the veil resumed, and the most frightened servant death had ever had was at last, after a century of running, made to stay. There was no body. There was never going to be a body, because the thing that had refused for a century to die properly had finally been required to do it properly. All at once, the way honest things fail, the way the unspeakable had said, and the grievance army of the lost world, which had bound its certainty to the certainty of its master, felt the certainty go out of the world in the same instant the island took its breath, and the battle at the threshold ended not in a rout but in a kind of waking. The lost families lowering their wands and looking around the cold chamber as people look around a room they cannot remember entering, the dream of rank that had carried them here dissolving with the will that had dreamed it, and the new order took them, alive, untouched where it could manage it, for the courts in the not Tuesdays, because that was the country, that was the whole of it, even now, even here, even at the root of the world, with the dust of the enemy still settling. And Harry Potter stood at the threshold of the veil, alive, the master of death who had not died, holding 3 old things that had finally finished the work they were forged for, and felt the country he had set down come back to him, the whole weight of it, the throne and the love and the marble and the warm cells, returning to the soles of his feet the moment the door shut, because he had given it up freely, and the giving up was the only price, and a man who pays the only price gets to keep the thing he paid for. Which is the cruelest and kindest arithmetic there is in the last lesson of the war, and the one his enemy had spent his whole existence being unable to learn. 8 asterisk 8 asterisk 8 asterisk. The aftermath was long, in the way aftermaths are, because the breaking of a thing takes an afternoon, and the mourning of what it cost takes a generation. They counted the dead, and the count was terrible, and Harry made himself read every name, as he had made himself read every file in Azkaban, because a founder who lets someone else carry the names is a founder who has begun to set down the weight, and the weight was the throne, and he would not set it down. Kingsley Shacklebolt, who had volunteered to tell him the truth once a week and died with the truth unspoken. Draco Malfoy, born to the old world, who chose the new, whose cut line in the atrium floor the whole country now walked across. The 9 in the Cotswolds, 2 of them children. The defenders of the courts in the dead of Cairgol, and the names from the long burning autumn, goblin and elf and centaur and wizard, the whole price of a country that had refused to be bought with fear and had paid instead in blood freely given, which is the only honest currency a just order ever has. Cassius Selwyn's trial had concluded in his absence from the news of the war exactly as Harry had promised, with a defense and an appeal and a verdict reached by a court he had not bought, and he had been convicted and sentenced to a warm cell to grow old in, and he had said at the end the one thing that surprised everyone, which was that it was a better country than the one he had run, and that he had not expected to live to say so, and that he was sorry. which from Selwyn was the strangest casualty of the whole war, a tyrant's conscience, exhumed by the demonstration that the thing he had said was impossible had been only forbidden. Edmund Rookwood's trial concluded too, and the country that he had tried to behead gave him the law instead of the fear, exactly as Harry had said it would, and the giving of it was the new order's deepest victory, the proof that it would protect even the man who had put a blade to its founder's throat, and Rookwood in his warm cell was said to have wept at the verdict not from relief, but from the unbearable weight of having been wrong about the one thing he had built his treason on, which was the belief that the principal was naive. Eight spoked asterisk, eight spoked asterisk, eight spoked asterisk. Hermione found him at the end of it, in the deep chamber alone at the threshold of the quieted vale where he had stayed after the army went up, because there was a thing left to do that only he could do and only she could witness. "You came back," she said. She had the record in her hands, the ledger of his soul, every entry, every reported wanting. "He built a trap whose only counter was your death, and you walked into it and beat it by being willing to die and then didn't, which is the most you thing that has ever happened, and I have known you for 20 years. The whole country is going to call it a miracle. I'm going to call it what it was, which is that you finally let go of something, and I have been trying to get you to let go of something since we were 11. I let go of all of it," Harry said. "For about a minute at the threshold, I set the whole thing down, the country, the throne, you, Tessa, everything, and then it came back because I gave it up freely, and the giving up was the only price." He looked at her and at the record in her hands, and he said the thing he had stayed in the chamber to say, "Which means I learned something about the compact that I have to tell you before we go up, because you're the one who keeps it, and it changes the keeping. I always thought the danger was that the love would wear me down, that one day I'd decide I was the exception and you'd have to fight me. That's still the danger. But I understand now what the answer to it is, and it isn't your record, though keep the record. The answer is that I have to be able to do at the throne what I did at the Vale. I have to be able to let go of it. Not threaten to, not perform letting go, actually be able to set the whole thing down freely in full possession of it, the way I set it down at the threshold. Because a man who can let go of power is the only man who can be trusted to hold it, and a man who can't is a Selwyn no matter how good his bindings are. The Veil taught me how to let go of my life. Now I have to spend the rest of that life learning to hold the throne the same way, lightly, ready to set it down every single day, so that the day the country needs me to go, I can go, the way I almost went today, and mean it." Hermione was quiet for a long moment in the cold light of the quieted veil, and then she opened the record and took out her quill and wrote, and when she finished she turned it so he could see the last entry, which read, "Today Harry Potter learned to let go and chose to hold the throne anyway, lightly, as a thing he could set down. Witnessed. The keeping continues. That's the new term," she said, "not that you'll never become the exception, that you stay able to leave. The day you can't imagine setting it down is the day I'll know, and I'll be watching for it every day for the rest of both our lives, because that's the job, and it turns out it's the best job there is, and I wouldn't give it to anyone else, and I wouldn't trust anyone else with you, including you." And she closed the record, and they went up together out of the deep chamber, the founder and the conscience, the man and the ledger of his soul, up through the building that had been the first battlefield and was now the heart of a country bound to a compact and not a man. Eight spoked asterisk, eight spoked asterisk, eight spoked asterisk. Ron came 3 days after, which was exactly like him, late and on his own terms and refusing to be summoned, and he came to Grimmauld Place rather than the Ministry, because the Ministry was the new country and Grimmauld Place was the old friendship, and Ron had always understood the difference between the two better than Harry had. He stood in the doorway of the drawing room where the war had been planned, where the long table still bore the marks of a year of maps, and he looked at the empty chair that had been kept at it in every plan since they were children, and he did not sit in it yet. "Dad's all right," he said, which was how Ron started the hardest conversations in the middle from the side. "The new courts kept him on, running the thing you said, the part that keeps the lifts going and the clerks calm. He's been promoted after 23 years by the country that replaced the one that wouldn't." Mum cried. He pretended he didn't. He turned the words over. "I read the record, Hermione let me, the whole ledger of you, every time you wanted to cross the line and didn't, and told her so. I came here ready to be angry at you for the rest of my life, Harry, for drawing a line through my mum's kitchen, for going fireproof and leaving the rest of us human, and then I read a year of you reporting your own worst moments to my brilliant, terrifying friend so she could keep a record to use against you, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't stay angry at a man who built a whole country whose first law is that he can be tried." He looked at the chair. "You said there'd be a chair for me when it was done. You said it in my mum's kitchen, and I thought it was the cruelest thing you'd ever said, because it sounded like you were already grieving me into the past tense." "It wasn't grief," Harry said. "It was a promise. The chair's been kept. It's the same chair. Nobody sat in it. They're not allowed. I made it a rule, which Hermione says is the most sentimental abuse of Founder's authority in the whole first year of the country, and she's right, and I did it anyway." He did not move toward Ron because Ron had to cross the room himself or it meant nothing, and they both knew it and had known it since they were 11. "Sit in it or don't, it's yours either way, I told you that. I built a country with a chair in it for a friend who was furious with me because a country that doesn't keep a place for the people it hurt isn't worth founding. You're the people it hurt. Sit down, Ron, or don't. But the chair's yours and it's going to stay yours, and that's not changing whether you sit in it tonight or in 10 years. Ron looked at the chair a long moment, and then he crossed the room and he sat in it, the way you sit in a thing that was always yours, and he put his elbows on the marked table where they had planned the end of the old world, and he said, right then, "What did I miss and who do I have to yell at? And is there any food in this enormous depressing house? Because I've come to be your friend again, not your subject, and friends get fed." And Harry laughed, which he had not done in a year, the real thing surprised out of him, and went to find Creature in the food, and the chair at the table was full, and the last line he had drawn through the people he loved was, if not erased, at least crossed back over, and that was the thing the throne could never give him and friendship could, and he took it gratefully in the old house in the dark. A man among his friends before he was an emperor among his subjects. Which was the only order of those two things that a person could survive. 8 asterisk 8 asterisk 8 asterisk Tessa found him on the fourth night, when the worst of the counting was done and the trials were scheduled, and the country had begun the slow work of believing it had survived. He had gone back to the small window high in the building that looked out at the Muggle city, the one he visited when the weight pressed hardest, and she came and stood beside him and looked out at the 11 million who governed themselves badly and freely under a sky that did not care who held the wards. "You went to the door ready to die," she said, "and you came back. I told you that you might. I told you the master of death is the one who can stand at the threshold and not run, and I want you to know that I have never in my life been so frightened as I was the hour you were down there, because being right about a thing like that is not the same as wanting to watch it tested." She kept her eyes on the Muggle lights. "I'm a healer. I have spent my whole life on the side of the body, the side that fights to keep the thread from going loose, and you went down to the root of the world and let yours go on purpose. And the part of me that loves you wanted to drag you back up the stairs by your collar, and the part of me that respects you knew that the willingness was the only thing that could save the country. And I have been living in the gap between those two parts for 4 days, and I would like, if it's all the same to you, to stop." "Then stop," Harry said. "It's done, the door's closed, he's through it and staying, I don't have to do it again." He turned from the window. "I learned something at the threshold I have to spend the rest of my life on, about holding the throne lightly, ready to set it down. But there's a difference between being willing to let go of a thing and going looking for the chance to. I'm not going looking, I came back. I came back to the country and the council and Ron in his chair and you at this window, and I came back on purpose, because the willingness to die for a thing is supposed to be in service of living for it, and I intend to live for it, and I would like very much for some of the living to be the part where I'm only a man and you hold the part of me that isn't a country, the way you did. The 2 times that were the best thing either of us has ever done." He took her hand, the competent healer's hand that had held him twice, that had healed Neville's line past the point any line should hold. "I can't offer you a small life. I tried to think of how to, and there isn't one. I'm the least free man in Britain, and that's not going to change. It's written into the stone. But I can offer you the truest one there is, which is a man who reports his worst moments to one friend and lets another keep his soul in a ledger and would let a third yell at him for going fireproof, and who would like to add a fourth thing to the list of things that keep him human, which is you at this window on the nights the weight is worst, reminding the Emperor that he is also a person, because somebody has to, and you said once you decided it was you. And I have decided I would like that to be permanent." She was quiet a moment, looking at him in the light of the window, and then she did the thing she had done in the chain chair in Courtroom 10 a lifetime ago, which was to be steadier than the situation deserved. "I came up out of the worst place in Britain holding on to exactly one thing," she said, "which was that you tried it the right way even when the right way couldn't work, and then you built a country where the right way works. So yes, Harry. Permanent on one condition, which you like, because it's the same condition all your best people give you." She held his eyes. "The day you stop coming to this window, the day the weight stops bothering you, the day you can hold the throne without needing anyone to remind you you're a man, I'll know, because you'll have become comfortable, and I have watched a great many people die, and the comfortable ones were always the ones who'd stopped being able to feel the thread. So I'll hold the part of you that isn't a country for as long as you keep needing it held, and the day you stop needing it is the day I worry, and that's the whole of what I have to offer, which is a healer who will never once let you forget you can still be hurt, because the day you can't be hurt is the day you've become the thing you tore down." And she stayed at the window with him, and the Muggle city went about its free and ungoverned night below them, and the Emperor of magical Britain stood in the dark being, for an hour, only a man, which was the rarest and most necessary thing in his entire country, and the only thing in it that no compact could provide and no enemy could take. 8 asterisk 8 asterisk 8 asterisk. It was dawn when Harry came up into the atrium, and the light that came down through the great enchanted windows fell first on the Change Monument, on the goblin standing with its sword and the elf with its hand held out level and the centaur with its head up and the healer with Tessa's face, and then on the cut line in the floor where Draco Malfoy was remembered by what he chose, and then on the ordinary clerks of an ordinary morning. Beginning to arrive for the ordinary work that was the actual substance of a country. The lifts running, the memos moving, Arthur Weasley at his small table with his kettle and his sign. "Keep calm, work continues," pouring tea for the early arrivals as though the root of the world had not been decided in the dark beneath their feet, which was exactly right, which was the whole point, because a good foundation is one you never feel. Tessa was waiting for him by the monument, and Neville beyond her, weary and alive, and the council and the country, and the weight came down onto Harry's shoulders in the dawn light like a second gravity, the throne, the actual throne, the one with no marble that weighed more than any country he could see. And he carried it because that was the job, and he had learned at the Vale the only way to carry it that did not turn the carrier into the thing he had torn down, which was lightly ready to set it down. Free to leave, he had shattered a ministry and forged an empire and crushed the thing that had tried to seize it, and he stood now at the top of the world he had made, the most powerful wizard who had ever lived and the least free, an emperor who had won everything and a man who had learned at the threshold of death to hold all of it the way you hold a thing you love, which is openly ready to let it go. The old world had ended. The ministry that scheduled its cruelties for Tuesdays was gone, the rot cut out at the root, the bell that summoned the wards to one man's hand melted down. In its place stood a country bound to a single sentence in the stone that the powerful answer first and hardest, with a founder bound under it as its first and most liable servant, his own life pledged on goblin terms against his keeping of the trust. It would not be perfect. Hermione had taught him that no country is, and that the ones that claim to be are the dangerous ones. It would be argued about in courts on days that were not Tuesdays. It would fail in the places where he failed, and it would have to be kept daily forever by people brave enough to be afraid of him out loud. But it would be honest, and it would be just as long as the keeping held, and it had a chair at every table for everyone the old world had made kneel, and a cut line in its floor that said blood was not destiny, and a man at its head who had walked to the root of death and let go of everything and come back able at last to rule without becoming the thing he ruled against. The dawn came up gold over a changed magical Britain, and Harry Potter, master of death, founder and emperor and the least free man in his own country, stood in the light he had paid for and took up the weight he had chosen and carried it forward into the long, ordinary work of keeping a promise, which is the only empire worth forging and the hardest and the one no statue can ever show. Chapter 7 End.